Hello, good morning and welcome to the Native Oyster Network Symposium 2020, hosted by the Bangor University Shellfish Centre. My name is Celine Gamble, the coordinator of the Native Oyster Network, and before I hand over to the official welcome by Lewis LeVay, I just want to run over some of the kind of overview of the symposium and some logistics of this Zoom conference before we get started. Could I have my next slide, please? Please, could I have my next slide? Great, thank you. So the format of the meeting today, we'll be having a welcome by the Bangor University Shellfish Centre, Professor Lewis LeVay. We'll be hearing some updates from the Native Oyster Network by Alison Debney. We'll be hearing about some of our network publications by Dr. Joanne Preston. We'll be hearing a series of speed updates from native oyster restoration projects, research groups and industry representatives throughout this meeting as well. And at 11:30, we'll be having a tea break, and we're welcoming everyone to go on Twitter and take a look through some of the posters that have been submitted to the symposium today. So throughout the symposium, we'll be hosting 3 discussion sessions. So the first, discussion 1 will be collaboration and joint work, chaired by Alison Debney. It will be taking place at around 11:15. We'll be having discussion number 2, which will be the sourcing of oysters for restoration, chaired by Morven Robinson at 12:20 approximately. And discussion 3, which is horizon scanning and research gaps by Dr. Joanne Preston around 12:35. Please have my next slide. So in terms of the format, as I mentioned, we'll be having speed presentations. They'll be around 3 minutes in length. So just a note to speakers to try and keep to time as we've got a lot to run through today. During these speed presentations, we'd like to welcome delegates to add any questions they have in the Q&A function in Zoom. And then the presenter will be able to answer those questions after they've finished presenting through the text function, just so we keep to time. For discussions, as I mentioned, we've got chairs and we've got 5 panelists that have been pre-selected to take part in the symposium, and they'll also be covering questions that have been pre-submitted. We'll then welcome all delegates to use this Mentimeter app, which I'll explain in a moment, to participate and capture your thoughts on our discussions. However, if you have any questions that you'd like to flag to the chair during these discussion sessions, we'd like you to add them into the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll be able to see if they've got enough time to answer that direct question. And just so panelists who are taking part in discussions and also presenters are aware, you'll be upgraded to be able to share your sound and video just before your presentation, and you'll be kind of given a little nudge just beforehand. Just if there's any questions, please feel free, any problems with any of the presenters getting onto that function or any panelists, please message myself, which you'll be able to find on the panelist participants list, myself or Maria Hayden Hughes, which is named as a Shellfish Centre, and we'll be able to help you out. So Mentimeter, it's kind of like a real-time presentation feedback app. So you can log into Mentimeter using this kind of web address on the screen here. And we're going to just do a little practice run now. Just so you're aware, throughout the symposium, when we'll be using Mentimeter, I've put a little kind of logo on the screen when you can expect to be participating through this app. So if you all just put in Mentimeter, www.mentimeter.com, either on your web browser or on your phone, and then if you put in the code 1826962, we have some practice questions on Mentimeter now, just to kind of show how it will work during the symposium today. So the first question on Mentimeter should be, where are you joining us from today? So yeah, if you log in using those details I just shared, then we should be able to give it a go. Just give everyone a few minutes to log in there. So resharing the code. So the login is www.menti.com and the code is 1826962. 1826962. So yeah, just some simple questions to get us going today, just to kind of get an idea of where everyone is joining from today. Give that a few minutes to run. And if anyone's having problems with Mentimeter, I've also got the kind of login details on each slide that you'll be expected to participate. So we'll move on to the next Mentimeter question, which is, have you previously attended a network meeting of ours before? Just do this really quickly. So as you can see, we'll kind of use this function during discussions as a way for everyone to kind of capture everyone's thoughts as we're not in person today. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. And what people were hoping to gain from the network symposium today. So there's three options, yeah, three different text boxes on this one. And then we should be able to build up some nice word clouds from the symposium today, and we'll be sharing all of the content that we've captured from Mentimeter in the minutes when we share them after the symposium. Leave that running a little bit longer. Yeah, so the meeting today will be running from 10 until 1, and we do have a tea break in the middle of that as well. Okay. Looking good. I think we're going to go back to the presentation slides now, but I think you can still participate in that even though it's not shared on the screen. So please do continue to add your thoughts. If I could get my slides back up. Great. So finally, just before I hand over to Lewis, we'd like everyone to join the online conversation on Twitter using these handles, social media handles. So feel free to take a photo of this if you're not already following us on these platforms on Twitter. So yeah, please do share your thoughts about the symposium online today. And also, just so everyone's aware, we're also now live recording and streaming this symposium onto YouTube. The only people that will be streamed will be the presenters presenting and also the panelists, but just so everyone is aware. So now I'd like to welcome Professor Lewis LeVay, who's the director of the Bangor University Centre for Applied Marine Sciences, and I'd like to officially welcome you all to this symposium. So over to you, Lewis.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So hopefully there'll be some slides to go with this. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Oh, you can start there. That one's good. That's second slide. So welcome everybody to the Native Oyster online conference today. I suppose it is online. I should make the point that we were really hoping to have this meeting hosted up in North Wales. This is where we would have been. Weather's, well, not quite that different, a bit cloudy, normal North Wales weather up here. And we would have been meeting in the Marine Centre Wales building, which is our new facility on the waterfront on the Menai Bridge site at the School of Ocean Sciences. Next slide, please. So in the Marine Centre Wales, we have a new centre that's been set up, the Shellfish Centre, which is supported by European funding through ERDF, through the Welsh European Funding Office. And it's a centre which has been established, as all ERDF funding is, to help support economic development, but we're focusing on science to support the shellfish sector within Wales. Next slide, please. And taking a step back, this is a slightly roundabout way. I'm going to get back to oysters by the end of this little intro, don't worry. Shellfish in general, why focus on shellfish? We're coming at shellfish really from a food production point of view, through fisheries and through aquaculture. And I think, as most people on this call will be fully aware, filter feeding shellfish are excellent sources of nutrition, whether that's protein or micronutrients or fatty acids. They have positive environmental effects, and they are very low input, low carbon food production systems. So there is a real opportunity looking at how do we meet the Sustainable Development Goals in the years ahead for incorporating shellfish production in that mix. Next slide, please. We talk about this quite a lot. Shellfish food production is very sustainable, it's low carbon. If you actually look at the numbers, it's quite striking. So this is a slightly old study. There are some newer ones that have come out, but it's quite a nice meta-analysis of the carbon footprint of different animal protein food production systems. And in the red circle there are the bivalve shellfish. Those are mussels and oysters, which have a carbon footprint of somewhere around a kilogram of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of protein. And you can compare those with terrestrial animal food production. You might say, well, why does this matter? How much carbon we produce in producing food? Well, I hadn't realized this until I was writing something quite recently, that about 27% of total global carbon emissions come from food production. So anything we can do to perhaps transfer some of those high footprint animal production, protein production numbers into shellfish is going to contribute to decarbonisation of food production. Next slide, please. And this has been identified in a nice report. Those of you who haven't seen it, the SAPIR report produced under the Scientific Advice Mechanism to the European Commission, which was asked this question. It said, how can you produce more food from the sea without undermining the benefits for future generations? So how can we most sustainably produce more food in the oceans? And it's quite an extensive study, and they come to the conclusion quite unequivocally that it's low trophic species, the herbivorous filter feeders that provide the core potential for meeting this objective. Next slide, please. And I'm certainly preaching to the converted, I think, here in terms of talking about ecosystem services from shellfish. So I won't dwell too long on these. So there's obviously nutrient remediation. Next slide, please. And biodiversity, whether that's complex structured reefs or food support to other species, whether that's birds or fish. Next slide, please. We shouldn't forget also the ecosystem services in the cultural aspect of ecosystem services. So, you know, shellfish have contributed to coastal communities for many generations, whether that's through long established multi-generational fisheries, and now more recently aquaculture operations, and the food that's provided over the centuries, and the way that people engage with shellfish, whether it's through modern day festivals for seafood, such as oyster festivals, or more formal ones like this oyster feast in Colchester in the bottom left there. Next slide, please. This is a nice summary of all of this. This is the value of non-food production ecosystem services from shellfish farming globally. This was done by Andy van der Schat-Olivier as part of his PhD here in Bangor. He's recently moved on to Portsmouth. But Andy's study added up the value of all these, not all the non-food services. So it's carbon sequestration, nutrient remediation, and use of shell as aggregate. And it came out as up to $10 billion a year as value from shell fisheries. And this didn't include, interestingly, valuation of biodiversity support, which is probably an even larger number, but is quite difficult to quantify. Next slide, please. So, segue back into Wales and shellfish. So what are we doing in Wales? Well, we're really trying to use the science base that we have here in Bangor through collaborative partnerships with industry. So all the work we do is directed to industry needs. So we can't take our grant money and go and do what we like. All our projects or sub-projects within the Shellfish Centre are determined by concerns or issues that industry have or opportunities that they've identified. But really the focus is about taking this potential for shellfish as sustainable food production in a high quality environment with low impact on the environment, and to increase that production here in Wales. And next slide, please. This hasn't come from nowhere. So we have a long history of working with shellfish producers here in Menai Bridge. And in fact, the idea of even setting up the Shellfish Centre came from our collaborations with the mussel producers in the Menai Strait, the Bangor Mussel Producers Group. And I put this slide in because, well, partly to illustrate this history, but also to make the point that we're based here in the School of Ocean Sciences, which is a multidisciplinary marine science centre. And working with shellfish is a multidisciplinary activity. So all our work with the mussel farmers over the years has ranged from, it's not really aquaculture, it's ecology, including from marine ecologists, bird ecologists, through to physical oceanographers and ecological modelers. So there's kind of a wide range of skills being brought to bear on understanding how shellfish systems work in the wider environment. Next slide, please. And as a quick aside on this, I just thought I'd pop this in out of interest. This work with the mussel producers is kind of moving offshore at the moment. So we have a parallel project with EMFF support, looking at producing shellfish in offshore waters around Wales, which we see as the greatest potential for increasing production in the short term over the next maybe 5 to 10 years or so. And again, I put this in to make the point. So this covers the whole remit. So we have technology and production trials on a test site off Anglesey, but also a lot of wider modeling, whether that's physical hydrodynamic modeling or ecological modeling, looking at the optimal sites and capacity for increasing shellfish production sustainably offshore. Next slide, please. The Shellfish Centre itself, we had a target to run about 20 projects with industry partners over the lifetime of the project. We've got about 15 up and running at the moment, and we still have a couple of years of this tranche of funding to go. So I think we'll exceed that. And we're running them in a range of prioritised areas which have been identified through working through stakeholder workshops and an ongoing interaction with our industry collaborators. And they all sit in these. I'm not going to go through each one with the time available, but a wide range of different aspects of sustainability of shellfish production. Next slide, please. And in that roundabout way, that brings me back to oysters and the topic of today's meeting. So we do, within those 20 projects, have 2 or 3 projects focused on native oysters. Again, our focus is on the food production aspect. So we're looking at the potential for recovering some fisheries production for native oysters here in North Wales, focusing on the Conway. Our partners are the Conway mussel producers, who have a traditional hand-raked mussel fishery and have for many generations in the Conway. And these guys in the picture here will be raking a very long time before they find another native oyster, as there are none at the moment, as far as we know. Though North Wales, of course, as with most of elsewhere in the UK, did in the past have very healthy populations of native oysters. So this is work being led by Maria and David in the meeting today, and the poster here is on ResearchGate if you want to look at it. It's accessible there. And so it's looking at an approach of establishing a source and sink fishery. So this is locating broodstock in the estuary and using hydrodynamic modeling and ecological mapping to identify suitable sink areas, hopefully to catch some spat and start establishing a self-supporting population. So this is very similar to many restoration projects, but because of our focus and our industry focus, the goal eventually is to diversify this fishery and to support a sustainable fishery with some oysters included as well. Okay, I'm past my time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to Alison Debney, who's going to run through some Native Oyster Network updates. So welcome to the Shellfish Centre, and I hope this is a really productive meeting.
Thank you very much, Lewis. That was a very interesting tour of the Shellfish Centre. We look forward to working with you guys going forward. So it's 2 years now since the Native Oyster Network was established. I think it might have been even this week, 2 years ago. And at these anniversaries and these milestones, it's always really helpful and healthy, I think, to reflect on the journey you've been, what you've achieved, and start to shape where you're going to go over the next few years. If we look back to 2017, 2018, marine habitat restoration, certainly in the UK, wasn't really common parlance. There was a few of us nutters who had a penchant for a small bivalve, and we were trying to lead the way, but we were finding our way and having to look over the Atlantic really for inspiration on how to do it, and obviously talking to our industry partners as well. Joe and I were lucky enough to go on the invitation of TNC to the West Coast of America back in 2017 to learn how they had been undertaking marine habitat restoration, and especially with oysters. And it was really inspiring. It was amazing how we could see how science, industry, government, communities and even the army were working together to restore their native oyster. It was also slightly overwhelming when we looked at the scale that they were working at. And it really came home to us, something that we'd been talking about, how if we were ever going to achieve that level of restoration, we would need to do it as a collective. We would need to be able to collaborate together to make it happen. And so that's where the Native Oyster Network came from. And we came home and worked hard to secure funding, which we did from the John Ellerman Foundation. Now, I feel like we've come a long way from there. And I think it is now accepted that if we're going to achieve ocean recovery, active marine habitat restoration is an essential part of that. And I feel that as a network, and all of us as part of the network, we've demonstrated that. We've provided the evidence for that. And it's been working with partners such as the Environment Agency and their excellent project REACH and Remedies. I think that's the right one, not the seagrass one, who are able to take our work and put it under the noses of government so that they feel more confidence and can see the evidence of how active marine habitat restoration is a part of the future. Now, looking to the future now, over the next few years, I think we are in a very different place to where we were back in 2017, 2018. The global platform is different. I think you most have all heard mention of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which is coming up starting 2021. And this is happening because it is a proven measure, habitat restoration, to provide resilience to climate change, provide us with food security, protect and increase biodiversity once more. Or locally in Europe, I know we're no longer members of the European Union, but it's very interesting to see as part of the next 10-year biodiversity strategy in Europe, they are going to have a habitat restoration plan with some clear defined outputs to start to recover the environment, including in wetlands. We've also got the Climate COP 2021, and here we hope the government, UK government, will be advocating that healthy marine habitats will provide resilience and help mitigate against the impacts of climate change. So our policy platform is there. And I very much think that the network and the work that we're going to do is in a strong position to really advocate and really get support behind us to move marine habitat restoration forward, so we are able to start to recover our oceans. I said that. Next slide, please. So where are we as a network? Where have we come from over the last 2 years? Well, we've gone from 45 members up to over 160 network members from a wide range of disciplines. That's brilliant. And we're really keen that if anyone who's listening today is not a member, but to get into touch and sign up. You're not signing your life away or anything. It's very much a collection and a knowledge sharing platform. I've missed my points actually, and there's one. We've now grown to 11 native oyster restoration projects. I think actually, that's a named project. I'm sure we have a lot more restoration sites. I think over 20 restoration sites around the country. And actually, if you wouldn't mind going back to the previous slide, please. Here, and I just wanted to touch really, we've grown so much, but we are looking at what are we doing and where we're going. And I just wanted to share again, once more, what our aims are. We're all working towards a vision of having healthy, resilient, self-sustaining populations of native oysters around the country. But the role that the network can play within that are threefold. We're really keen to facilitate an ecologically coherent and collaborative approach to native oyster restoration in the UK. Meetings such as today, where we're able to share knowledge and share lessons learned are really important, I think, if we're taking this agenda forward. Again, we're really keen to promote information sharing and effective communication of matters related to native oysters. So the science, the technology, the biosecurity measures going through. And we're also really keen, and our aim is to increase awareness of the cultural and environmental importance of native oysters, whether as ecosystem engineers or as a strong point of our society that has bounded communities over the years. So as we look forward to the next few years, we'd be really keen to hear whether you still think these aims are valid, drop us a line or add it on to Mentimeter later on, because this is how we'll continue to shape our programme of work to support all your work. Thank you. If I could go forward 2 slides now. So what have we been up to this year? Well, it's been a very busy year, as always. Going to our first aim, we've been convening and hosting several events and workshops. One of the key, some of the key ones were just before or on the doorstep of lockdown, we hosted a set of our science and conservation events. So this is a public meeting open to all. We had over 200 people attending, which was amazing, since everyone thought we were all the end of the world is about to happen. And we talked and gave great case studies exploring how marine habitat restoration supports all of us. We've partnered with Environment Agency over the year and the REACH project that I mentioned previously. And we had a great workshop called Developing Blue Restoration. And the Environment Agency managed to secure great representation from around the government departments. And we were able to present case studies again of how marine habitat restoration works for people and wildlife. And then with our sister network, NORA, we held 2 technical workshops, bringing in expertise from around Europe. One to develop a set of monitoring metrics that will measure our success or failures, and another one is to explore biosecurity, and that was kindly hosted by Heriot-Watt University. Next slide, please. So we had some building awareness. We've had an awful lot of outreach going on all the time. Everyone's very good on the social media. In collaboration with the BSAC, we launched a photographic competition. This is really twofold. One, selfishly, to get our hands on some great photographs, because it's very hard to communicate how amazing these species, this creature is, with when we haven't got any live pictures of it in situ, looking wonderful. So we've had, this is this is still running on. So if you've got any good photographs, please send it through. And even if you don't think they're competition winners, it would be brilliant to build up a bank of photographs of oysters that we can all use. We had our first celebration of World Oyster Day on the 5th of August, and that got great feedback. It was a big social media drive to promote oysters. We had about 15,000 or nearly 16,000 people saw our content, and an engagement of nearly 1,000 people sharing, liking, retweeting. Another great event that we attended and hosted was a New Scientist Live, and this was at the Excel Centre with thousands and thousands of people coming, and there we were able to talk about the wonders of oysters again. We've also been working on a lot of major outputs, but our colleague Joe Preston will be telling you about those next. Next slide, please. So as we're pushing forward to the next steps, we're really pleased to share that we have secured funding for a further 3 years for the post of the Native Oyster Network coordinator. So Celine, fingers crossed, will be staying on to lead that, and I'm sure you all agree she does an amazing job with that. So the funding was secured through Wild Oyster Project, and again, Celine will be telling us a bit more about that later. Just whilst, as we were saying at these milestones, we'll be looking at how we can frame the network, I don't know when more formally maybe. I mean, Joe and I have been pushing forward with it for the last 2 years, but we're very keen to set up a steering committee so that we make sure that the network meets the needs of all of its members. So we'll be doing that over the next couple of months. And whilst we're developing the next 3 years work plan, we'd be really keen to hear from all the members about how you think we're able to support your work. And there are going to be some questions on Mentimeter coming up now. If you could drop down some of your thoughts on any keywords, and if you don't feel like doing on Mentimeter, to email us directly, because we're very, very keen to hear from you. And we look forward to continuing to champion the work of native oyster restoration in the UK and Ireland. Thank you very much. I look forward to enjoying the rest of the day with you guys. Oh, now I need to introduce Joe. So coming up next is Dr. Joanne Preston, a co-founder of the Native Oyster Network and reader in marine ecology and evolution at the University of Portsmouth. Well, I can talk you through these questions if you'd like to. Oh, there we go. Everyone's coming through. And what would you like to see more from the network? I should actually write my own thoughts down, shouldn't I, while we're doing it? Oh, here we go. Some good pieces coming back through. Student partnerships. That's quite interesting, seeing people's thoughts, collaboration again, funding advice, results from the project. So hopefully things that we'll be able to draw out some of the discussions later on this afternoon again. Oh, loads of ideas, brilliant. Scaling up, looking at funding, how we can work together to get funding. And policy elements. Exchange visits, oh yes, I'd like to do that as well. When we're set free. Research and collaboration. That's brilliant. Well, at the end of this other meeting today, we'll be putting all these things together and we'll be able to present it back to the members of the group. TV appearances, is that you, Celine? Wanted to have it. But some great ideas and we'll look forward to it. Okay, here's the next question. Are there any particular areas of oyster habitat restoration in the UK that Network could particularly champion? I think probably in the last question, we had quite a few good ideas there as well, that links across. I think previously we've really been trying to bring all the experts together so that we can create dialogue and share understanding. And looking at integrated marine habitat restoration. It's very clever, this Mentimeter, isn't it? You can get great outputs before without any work as well. Well, after the preparation. Ecosystem services coming up quite key, explaining and sharing the role, I guess, of marine habitats in delivering these. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I jumped the gun by introducing Jo there, but I'm going to hand over to her now, so I'll say goodbye for now.
Thanks, Alison, for a lovely introduction, and apologies for the bright glow behind my head. So it's lovely to have you all today, even though I can't see any of you. And I'd like to go through some of the network publications that we've been working on over the last year. The main point of this talk today is to go through the European Native Oyster Restoration Handbook, UK and Ireland, which has been funded by the Environment Agency as part of their wider commitment to restoring meadows, marshes and reefs. The Rememori project and part of the wider reach restoring estuarine and coastal habitats that Alison mentioned earlier. And as many of you know here, there are many logistical challenges, legislative barriers and financial hurdles to overcome when you're trying to do a restoration project. So we thought it was vital as a network to support and facilitate groups and governments to overcome these challenges, which is why the handbook was written. This will be a trilogy of one of a trilogy of restoration handbooks for both seagrass, salt marsh and oyster. And the design you see today will be carried through to the other handbooks. We've also been working on the European Native Oyster Restoration Biosecurity Guidelines, which is currently open for consultation. And this is collaboration with NORA, the European Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. And the consultation is open until the 22nd of September. and that will be published before NORA 3 in November 2020 this year. And at the end of this talk, I'll mention the Native Oyster Monitoring Handbook and the role that will take, and that will also hopefully be wrapped up by November. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. So this is to provide a context of the Native Oyster Restoration Handbook, UK and Ireland, and to establish its context within its parent publications. So you can see the design and monitoring of shellfish restoration projects from 2006 and the restoration guidelines for shellfish reefs. And these are fantastic publications that come out of the Nature Conservancy and have really been built on the 50 years of restoration in America, North America particularly, relating to the species Chrysostia virginica. And these are fantastic and to be read in conjunction with the handbook we're producing. But what we needed was a species-specific handbook that dealt with the challenges of Ostrea edulis specifically. And this handbook is relevant across a biogeographic range of Ostrea edulis, but is also in the context of the licensing and policy framework of UK and Ireland, because there are many hoops to jump through. And of course, it was based on workshops and collaborative knowledge and online webinars. And as you'll see when I go through the handbook, one of the chapters is a synopsis of the European Native Oyster Biosecurity recommendations. The sort of more detailed and fuller version will be a European-wide publication that will be available on all the websites. And last but not least, all of these handbooks are embedded in the principles for the principles set forward by the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is absolutely crucial. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So this handbook, I'm going to give you a peek preview, a whistle-stop tour, and its aim is to provide functional but practical guidance on restoration and conservation of native oysters and native oyster reefs. So it is not an academic publication. Its primary audience is restoration ecologists and practitioners, and for that reason, the references and citations have been removed for flow and accessibility, but it is all evidence-based. Thank you. Next slide. This is just to give you an overview of the structure of the Native Oyster Restoration Handbook, and I'm just going to give you a very sort of introduction to each of those over the next few slides. Next slide, please. So here we go. This is the big preview. This is what it's going to look like. This is the design we've come up with in collaboration with some fantastic designers. This is the latest version from our designers, and so the pink boxes and writing are comments to us, so please ignore those. But the editorial team is myself, Celine Gamble, Alison Debney, Luke Helmer, Bose Hancock, and Feline Zuam Gassam, who are all here today. But that does not mean that we've been doing all the writing. It has been an incredibly collaborative and fantastic effort from many members of the network who are here today. And we are held accountable by a steering committee to make sure we represented all nations and stakeholders throughout the document. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the opening 2 pages of the introduction and chapter 1, which is Native Oyster Restoration and Introduction. And what we have aimed to have done throughout this handbook is provide restoration practitioners with the information and tools they need as part of their communications, their funding applications, their feasibility projects, and also as a tool to inform policymakers and the non-academic audiences. And so this provides a context of the decline and exploration of what native oyster habitat would have looked like. Obviously, we have the challenge of not having a reference ecosystem for Ostrea edulis, or very few examples. So we provide some historical ecology and some reef definitions. It also provides a rationale for the need to restore oyster habitats, including the sort of quantified ecosystem services and beneficiaries of oyster restoration. It also gives an overview of the biology and ecology and current restoration efforts and conservation designations. Next slide, please. So this is not the final infographic, don't worry. This is an example of the brief that we've sent the handbook designers. And we've commissioned a whole series of infographics because these are very important for policymakers and non-academic audience to really communicate the marine ecosystem services and benefits provided by native oysters. And so hopefully these will be useful to the wider network going forward. Right, next slide, please. So chapter 2. This was the chapter that I was left to be editor on, and really this is all the things I wish I knew 5 years ago when I started doing native oyster restoration. Again, infographics are put to good use. There's some very practical tools such as restoration timelines, and it is based on the SER approach of a goals and objectives approach to oyster restoration. In this chapter, we have help with feasibility studies, site selection, the bartic and abartic characteristics of suitable habitat, maps of potential restoration areas. We have information on working in MPAs and fisheries, and a very comprehensive section on planning and license requirements. And even that is a summary of a more in-depth PDF that's going to be on both the NORA and non-UK and island websites. And as with all chapters, this has been based on case study examples of projects throughout UK and Ireland where available. Next slide, please. And so again, this is not the final infographic. This is an example of the tools we are offering with the handbook. And this is a getting started decision tree, which embeds in it both biosecurity and standards of ecological restoration, and really helps projects right at the beginning identify suitability, whether their site is recruitment or substrate limited, and puts them in the direction of other requirements may need for different licensings, etc. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 is oyster restoration in practice, and Bose Hancock and Luke Helmer did a fantastic job in putting this chapter together with many, many authors. As you can see, each chapter has many co-authors. And this basically provides an overview of all the techniques you can use to achieve restoration and success once you've done your plan, your feasibility study, and got your funding. And it also is really, we wanted this chapter to promote an ambitious scale of oyster restoration. And therefore it does conduct information and an ambition to conduct oyster restoration projects at scale, but it includes examples across the whole spectrum, including small scale and pilot community projects, which, if we're honest, most of our restoration is still at that level, but we want to be ambitious with the scope of this. And so it provides detailed and practical information on sourcing oysters, identifying the appropriate restoration action, deployment techniques, including several quite technical tables with overviews of the different methods available. And determining whether a site is recruitment or substrate limited is a key part of this. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. This is chapter 4, which is obviously a very important chapter, this biosecurity and native oyster restoration. And I said this is a synopsis of the European-wide publication that will be out in November. I say again, it's out for consultation, so please do have a look at it. The links are on both the NORA and non websites. And although we have a separate chapter on biosecurity in chapter 4, it is emphasised throughout the whole of the handbook. And this chapter looks at the suite of considerations you need to take when translocating oysters and culture, and as well as biosecurity guidelines for oyster hatcheries. And they really emphasise the responsibility to go above and beyond current legislation recommendations of restoration practitioners to integrate biosecurity within the whole of the, my timer. Next slide, please. So last but not least is the chapter 5, which was public engagement and communications for restoration projects. This is an absolutely vital part of restoration, is why we've been collecting pictures on the Oyster Quest and the infographics throughout this handbook, because engaging with both the public and the media is vital, but often is not something that becomes is easily done, or people aren't really naturally or comfortably doing, particularly academics and conservationists often. So this gives a whole load of engagement tools and for engaging with the media, as well as different types of outreach you can do, both community and education outreach, and also how to monitor the success of your outreach approaches. Thank you. So that is the end of the peak preview for the Oyster Restoration Handbook. And my final slide is just to give a synopsis of what we are moving on to, as well as the European Biosecurity Guidelines. It's the European Native Oyster Monitoring Handbook. And again, I've just given the landscape of the sort of heritage of this handbook based on the Bagot et al. Oyster Habitat Restoration Monitoring and Assessment Handbook, and again, Brumbaugh et al. In 2006, as well as the International Principles for Ecological Restoration. And this is a truly pan-European approach. It is not sort of confined to UK and Ireland, because if we have a consensus of monitoring metrics and methods across all of European restoration projects, then we can really start to build up that database of ecosystem services metrics and how we can enable and facilitate success and learn from our failures. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to hand over to Celine Gamble, who is the Native Oyster Network Coordinator, and she's going to provide an update on the projects.
Thanks, Jo. Next slide, please, Maria. Thank you. So today I'm going to be introducing the new Wild Oysters project. So Wild Oysters is a new project that's been established by a new partnership between the Zoological Society of London, the Blue Marine Foundation and British Marine. And with our combined expertise in education, research, marine policy and native oyster restoration, we've recently been awarded funding by the People's Postcode Lottery's Dream Fund for a 3-year national oyster restoration project in the UK. And Wild Oysters is working together to restore life, inspire action, and achieve systems change. Next slide, please, Maria. So the project will be delivering 3 new oyster rehabilitation hubs in England, Scotland, and Wales. And in each site, we'll be working with local delivery partners who will be employing dedicated local project officers, helping us to deliver the project locally. We'll also be working with 2 marinas in each site to deliver the project. So in England, our local delivery partner is the Groundwork Northeast and the Tyne Estuary Partnership, and we'll be delivering the project in the Tyne and Wear coastal water body. In Scotland, our local delivery partner is the Clyde Porpoise CIC and the Fairlie Coastal Trust, and we'll be delivering the project in the Firth of Clyde. And in Wales, we'll be working with the Bangor University Shellfish Centre to deliver the project in Conwy Bay. And in the long term, we're hoping for the legacy of this project to build and for these coastal partnerships to scale up and grow with the technical input and advice from the 3 partners. Next slide, please, Maria. So we've developed a flexible model of activities gained from the kind of expertise and experience through the various different restoration projects we've been involved with to address the 3 main barriers to native oyster restoration, which is A, the lack of mature native oysters or broodstock, B, the lack of settlement substrate, and the fact that oysters have in some areas become lost from living memory. So our flexible model of activity includes the installation of oyster nurseries, which, as many of you will know, have been trialled and proven by the Solent Oyster Restoration Project. And for the purpose of this project, we'll be installing 124 nurseries into our 6 marina sites around the UK, which in total, we expect to release around 9 billion oyster larvae over the 3 years of the project. We'll also be carrying out seabed restoration in the areas local to the marina sites that will be identified through baseline surveys and hydrodynamic modelling, and each location will differ somewhat. But an example of the kind of seabed restoration that's been carried out in Essex through the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative is through culture deployment and kind of rebuilding the seabed. And we'll also be carrying out an extensive public outreach and education programme, which will see us reaching around 50,000 members of the general public and over 12,000 school students over the 3 years. So this is just a whistle-stop tour, and kind of this is the model that we've come up with for each of the 3 sites, and we're now in the process of working with our delivery partners and local agencies and stakeholders to kind of develop the project further and kind of making it more site-specific to each of our locations. Next slide, please, Maria. So I just thought I'd end on what we're kind of hoping to achieve through this project, just to end on today. So we're hoping that the project will continue to contribute to the UK native oyster population becoming on the road to recovery. So our mission is for the UK seas to have self-sustaining populations of native oysters, which in turn provide those kind of clean water, healthy fisheries and plentiful biodiversity, which contributing to the kind of rewilding of our seas and restoring local ecosystem services. And through our partnership with our kind of local marinas and local stakeholders, we're really hoping to promote the kind of ecosystem service benefit that native oysters can bring. And through our outreach and education program, we're aiming to reconnect people, including local students, with nature and kind of hope to inspire the next generation of marine stewards. So the project started on the 1st of June this summer, and so we'll be running for 3 years. So we're very much at the beginning of this new Wild Oysters project. And yeah, you guys can be expecting to see more about the project as it progresses in the coming months as well. So that's everything from me in terms of this project. So next up in the speed presentations, we'll be hearing from Oliver Tully about native oyster restoration in Ireland.
Good morning, everybody. I'm here in Galway on the west coast of Ireland, and I'm going to give you an update on what we're doing here and have been doing in 2020 and going back to 2017. We have oyster stocks or oyster populations in at least, I suppose, six areas, 6 locations. And we're now working on oyster restoration in 4 of those in Lough Swilly on the north coast, Clew Bay, Kilkieran Bay and Galway Bay. All of these areas are in need of some degree of some restoration work because the populations are depleted. Our population in Tralee Bay we would regard as not needing restoration. It's a fully productive and productive population with about 120 tonnes of fishery landings every year. There's a lot of people involved in the project, obviously, with the oyster fishery co-ops, other agencies like BIM, ourselves in the Marine Institute. The project continues to be funded by the European Maritime Fisheries Fund under the biodiversity scheme at the Marine Institute. And we've tried to identify particular issues in each of these sites. There's lots of issues probably, but if you could pick 1 or 2, these are probably the issues you would pick. Pacific oysters, settlement habitats, sensitive habitats and SACs, and post-settlement mortality rates are pretty high in some areas. Next slide, please. So in each of the areas, we've identified certain actions this year and last year. Most of the work is going on in Galway Bay. In Lough Swilly in the north coast, our main issue here is the co-occurrence of Pacific oysters with native oysters. From a survey in July of this year, we know we have about 2,000 tonnes of naturalised Pacific oysters cohabiting with native oysters in this site, and that's a major issue. We're trying to develop a business plan for the removal of these oysters with the local industry. It's a significant problem though. We have an expanded Bonemia program now. We're just in the middle of that. In each of these sites, we'll be able to update on prevalence and intensity of Bonemia in different subsites within each of these areas later this year. We are involved in coach deployment in almost all of the areas at small scale and in Galway at a slightly bigger scale. And we are also trying to enhance kind of settlement using spatting ponds. Also in Galway, we have two ponds working with Irla Canellan, most of you know, on spatting ponds. We have coach deployment on rafts and coach deployment on seabed. One of the problems in some of the sites is trying to weave our way through the network of sensitive habitats and trying to avoid those areas. This is a map here of Kilkieran Bay, for instance, in Connemara, showing native oysters outside of marl habitat and next to mixed sediments. So it's just demonstrating that sometimes it's difficult to know where to locate restoration actions and avoiding sensitive habitats. Next slide, please. most of the work is still going on in Galway, and we've scaled up this year in terms of culch deployment and trying to be more precise about about when to deploy culch. We've been monitoring gonad development and maturity. We have larval work going on. We've seen kind of significant peaks in larval production this year, but often those peaks don't lead to settlement. We've had an unusual year with storm events in midsummer, leading to population crashes of those larval populations. Our culch deployment as well, we have been thinking about how to deploy culch. And in Galway, we decided to produce a culch reef, as it were. And here you see a side scan sonar image from Nick Chopin and BIM, showing the culch deployed in about 6-7 meters of water. That's about 100 tons. The dimensions are about 50 square meters, or 50 meters by 50 meters or so. So later in the year, we'll be monitoring settlement, monitoring whether we have settlement on raft culch or seabed culch. We know we have settlement already in the spatting ponds, but we will need to wait for another month or two prior to setting up a monitoring program for the culch on seabed. And from then on, we'll be monitoring survival and growth of spat on culch for the rest of the year and into next spring. Okay, so there's a lot of activities going on in 4 sites, and we hope to continue monitoring into 2021. Thank you.
Okay, so next up, we will be hearing from Dr. Luke Helmer with an update presentation on the Solent Oyster Restoration Project.
Thank you, Celine. I've been asked to do this very quickly, so I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of what's been going on as part of the Solent Oyster Restoration Project. With COVID, it's been a bit of a blessing in that we've been able to get to the desks and actually get some of our license applications up to the point of being almost ready for submission. So hopefully within the near future, we should have some large-scale reef deployments ongoing. Next slide, please. For anyone that doesn't know where we are, we're down on the south coast of England, the stretch of water that separates the Isle of Wight from the mainland UK. And we're working in a variety of areas on there. Next slide, please. And just following on from some of the work that Celine's already mentioned, so our oyster nurseries that we've been monitoring over the past few years, we've got an ongoing study at the moment. And we've noticed that they've acted as artificial reefs. So we wanted to see if that was actually a factor of the oysters being within the nurseries, or whether it was simply the cage structure and providing that physical structure for them. So we've had down in Portsmouth Harbour a variety of cage structures out there, one set of 3 with just the cages, another set with the micro reefs inside them, and then the final set with the cage structure, micro reefs and oysters in there. We went out before COVID kind of every other week, and we put a net beneath each of the cages and pulled them up and monitored the number of species and different number of species in each of those cages. We've been out once since we were allowed to, since lockdown has eased, and you can see at week 16 where we are now, that the oysters themselves are providing a habitat for more organisms than the cage structures themselves, which is absolutely fantastic. It's exactly what we were hoping to find. We've been finding all sorts of fish species, we've been finding nudibranchs, and a whole range of diverse organisms. So a really exciting study, and that takes our total number of species to over 100 within the nursery. So it's great that this system is now being rolled out around the rest of the UK. Next slide, please. Following on again from the Hunt for Oyster images, and it shows the power of outreach and engagement. We've had a local diver from the Isle of Wight get in touch, and he's now been out hunting for oysters for us. And these are just a few of the images that he's been able to get during some of the good visibility that we've had over the last few months. Next slide, please. And a final good news story. Recently we were down in Lymington doing some filming with a Chinese English language TV company, and we found a critically endangered European eel in the cage, which has been picked up by various news outlets, which is again fantastic publication for the project, and great that we're finding more of these eels. And that's 3 sites now with over 60 eels at a variety of sizes, so something to look more into moving into the future. And if anyone's got any questions, feel free to look on the website and get in touch with myself and Jacob. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luke. So next up, we've got Dr. Bill Sanderson with some project updates from the Durnock Environmental Enhancement Project, the DEEP.
Hello, my name is Bill Sanderson. I'm from Heriot-Watt University. I'm going to be talking about the DEEP project. And DEEP is a partnership between the Glenmorangie Whisky Company, Heriot-Watt University and the Marine Conservation Society. And our work is focused on restoration in the Dornoch, but also this has caused us to branch out into a number of other locations. Next slide, please. So what we have ongoing at the moment is we have quite a lot of work that we've been doing over the summer, adjusting our program to cope with the present COVID situation. And now we've done that, we've extended our present phase of the project into next year. We've been looking at some of the shell reefs that we created in 2018 and looking at the stability of them. We're pleased to say that they're stabilizing very nicely. We've also been looking at oyster beds, working with Tristan and the Loch Ryan Oyster Company in Loch Ryan, to use the oyster habitats there as an analogue of where we're trying to get to with our own restoration work in the Dornoch. So we've been working in Loch Ryan quite a lot this year. We have an experiment ongoing with different shell types, looking at what outcomes that generates in terms of not just settlement, but also in terms of associated predators. We've continued to monitor our restoration sites environmentally, and we've also been looking at the oysters themselves, monitoring the growth and survival of those oysters. We had a campaign last year looking at larval monitoring in Loch Ryan, because we wanted to try and tie down the signals for maximum larvae in the water as a way of synchronizing culture deployment in future, both in Loch Ryan and in Dornoch. And along the way, we've done quite a lot more work on associated fauna on oyster habitats, including invasive non-native species. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to validate our biosecurity protocols, that they are not transferring invasive non-natives. Next slide, please. So the team has developed further. We have Hannah Lee, who you will be hearing from later, who's been working very much on blue carbon. And this is the latest stage in the development of our work on ecosystem services. We've been very involved in shellfish biodiversity and blue carbon and bioinference water quality work over the last few years. We've also started more detailed work with a new program on biodiversity, which is Naomi Kennan's project, which will be getting underway in earnest this month. And then also Ana Rodriguez Perez, who you may well have come across before, has undertaken a number of studies on oyster larval behavior with a view to understanding how their behavior influences their potential dispersal and connectivity from restoration sites. And now we also have Sean Marcus, who's working with us and based at Aberdeen, working on eDNA tools for testing for the presence of invasive non-native species when we're translocating oysters. And that's a potential way of speeding up and improving our biosecurity tools. I've put a clip of this paper in the top right, not because that's the be all and end all of it, but there's just to remind me that there's a whole string of publications coming out of our program now, some of which are in a special volume of aquatic conservation. Next slide, please. And that volume of aquatic conservation should be out, we hope, in November. And it's the product of the NORA 2 meeting that we were very pleased to host in Edinburgh over a year ago now in May 2019. Also coming out soon, we're working on bringing our project up to what we're calling an operational scale, which is beyond the optimization stage that we've been going through. And that's requiring, as Luke just mentioned in the Solent, we're processing a lot of licensing right now. And we're also doing quite a lot of rigorous work on the interaction between our activities and other nature conservation interests. The other big news from our project is that we are starting very shortly a partnership with the Orkney Shellfish Hatchery to try and unlock some of the supply chain issues in oyster restoration. And that's a whistle-stop tour of the many activities we've got going on within the DEEP project at the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. So next up, we're going to be hearing some research updates, the first half of research updates, and then we'll be hearing some more updates after we've had our discussion and tea break. But first up, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Smythe, who will be presenting on the unassisted return of Oyster edulis to Belfast Lough after a century of extinction.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Belfast. Sounds like the Eurovision Song Contest here. We all know the difficulties of restoring native oysters, and hopefully these 3 slides will maybe be a bit of inspiration for all those struggling at the minute. Just to give you a brief outline, Belfast Lough, so on the northeast coast of Northern Ireland, about 21 kilometres long, 11 kilometres wide, and max depth about 23 metres. It's the main water course to Belfast Port. Sees over 7,000 ships per year, roughly, with a tonnage of freight of about 24.6 million tonnes, so it's a full commercial port. The lough itself has a populace of about 450,000 people on either sides of the banks and up in the main head of the Lagan River, which runs into the Belfast Lough. There's been no native oyster restoration programs in the area, and there has been no past or present aquaculture of native oysters. There is 21 mariculture beds for Mytilus edulis within the lough, which, when you see near the end of the site here, might be significant. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it follows the same sort of timeline as all the native oyster fisheries in Europe and Ireland. So there's evidence of Oyster edulis within Mesolithic shell middens. There's Norman Castle at the head of the lough, and there's been large quantities of oysters shells excavated out of there. There must be quite a lot because it's been mentioned twice there. From the 1100s up until the 1700s. The fishery itself sort of first documented in 1780, and a dredger could dredge over 1,000 oysters a day. The fishery only really lasted about 40 or 50 years because by 1820 there was only 100 to 300 oysters being landed. 1903, the Irish Fisheries Commissions considered the fishery non-existent. And then in 1928, sort of the renowned malacologist, Dr. Macmillan, did a species list for intertidal and subtidal molluscan species and failed to find any living oysters. Sort of this species list was repeated by the Ulster Museum in 1999. And again, no living species were found. There was lots of documentation of subfossil Oyster edulis shells along the shore, which proved that there was a fairly prolific population there at one time. Next slide, please. So, top of the slide, good news, the natives have returned. So in 2018, Dr. Lynn Gilmore from Seafish contacted me to say that she'd found a solitary native oyster on the east shore of the loch. I was skeptical. 2019, then I got 2 more reports from members of the public to say that they had found native oysters on the west shore. 2020, I had my friend's children on the shore for a walk, and I found 4 oysters. And I thought there's something happening here. So this sort of spurred a survey of both sides of the intertidal shoreline of the loch. And we found oysters at 6 sites, 5 on the west and 1 on the east. With a total of, it's not big numbers, we're talking about 40 oysters here, and age groups from 0 to 1 up to maximum of 4 years. But the big question is, where did they come from? How can the native oyster have been extinct for over 100 years in this loch and suddenly appear? So there's four options or 4 hypotheses that we've looked at or considered. Could have come in with ballast water with the shipping. Highly unlikely because the pelagic phase is so temperamental. Biofouling, again, pretty unlikely. I don't know where you would go to moor a ship to get it fouled with native oysters in Europe at the minute because they're so rare. Dormant resident population could be a possibility because in the subtidal sites there may have been some oysters still present, and there's been quite a lot of dredging work, and the increase in shipping could have changed hydrodynamics to reconfigure the population so the allele effect is more pronounced, and there could have been a spawn. Number 4, introduced with seed mussels. So as I mentioned previously, there's 21 mariculture sites in the loch, and the seed mussel is dredged offshore and then laid out. And this may have led to the introduction of some fecund adults. And if that's the case, it could indicate to a population that hasn't been identified yet, which may lead to some broodstock sources in the future. I think that's it. Next slide. Oh, sorry, the next slide says goodbye. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, David. So next up, we're hearing from Charlie Mountain, presenting Greening the Handbook, a combined approach to salt marsh and oyster restoration in the Solent.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see some of you again. So yeah, I'm going to talk you through my PhD project at the University of Portsmouth today, which basically just aims to trial a combined approach to salt marsh and oyster restoration in the River Handbook in Southampton. And that's through the Greening the Handbook project with the Environment Agency too. So if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think we all know sort of the state of the native oyster nowadays in Europe and the UK. But similarly, salt marsh habitat has also declined quite drastically from its historical prevalence. So it's predicted that, between 2008 and 2108, I guess it would be, that 812 hectares of salt marsh will be lost. And that's just down to erosion alone. So finding a way of combining the restoration of these two organisms which live so close to each other seems like a feasible and a good approach to have. And previous work that we did within the River Handbook at these 2 sites, you can see in figure 2, they've basically concluded that there was a need for a more secure settlement substrate for the larvae of the oysters. And, sorry, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, so our plan is to deploy these bees elements, which are basically biodegradable potato starch grids. And we'll be deploying them at a range of different tidal heights through the intertidal down to the subtidal limit. There'll be 2 different trials, one mainly focused on oyster settlement, and they'll be in the lower intertidal, and then another trial focusing on salt marsh protection and that'll be in the higher intertidal. But for both, we will monitor all the same metrics, which have been outlined in the Oyster Monitoring Handbook by Baggett and all in 2016, as long as a few of our own metrics that we've added in as well for a more holistic approach. And you can see all of those listed on the right there. Yeah, we'll also be attaching oyster culture to the structures, as you can see in figure 3 there, likely with some sort of epoxy resin, so as to not let the flow rate just displace all of the culture, which I think has been a problem in the past. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, so basically that's the aim of this project. Obviously, we've had a few delays because of COVID recently, but that's let us get on with licensing, as a few others have mentioned. And now, yeah, really, it's just about getting back out in the field and trying to build up some sort of baseline data and framework to inform further work in the future. And I think the exciting thing for me is that there's the potential to collaborate with loads of other projects with this. I mean, there's been a couple of people mentioned collaboration with seagrass projects and all of that. So that's all good. And yeah, that's, I think, the main thing for me is looking forward to getting back out there. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Thank you. So I think, yeah, we're moving on to our first discussion next, chaired by Alison Debney, discussion on collaboration and joint work. So, yeah, Alison and the panelists should be kind of coming onto our screens shortly.
Hi, I can see everyone appearing. It's waiting for. Okay, well, hello again. So this is the first of our panel discussions. We have 15 minutes to explore well, 3 topics over the course of this meeting. Today, we're looking at collaboration and joint work and how best to maximize the outputs of the network by working together. So we've got a nice range of experts on our panel, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. And starting from the left of my screen, moving to the right, we'll start with Zara, Kieran, Jacob, Feline, and then Oliver. So Zara, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yes, I'm Zara Ravenscroft. I'm a senior marine officer at the Environment Agency, based up in the northeast of England. And I've been working and collaborating with Celine and the Wild Oyster Project.
Thank you. Kieran,
Kieran McGonigal, a marine scientist with the Lochs Agency, a fishery authority based in the northwest of Ireland.
Jacob?
My name's Jacob Keane-Hammerson. I work for the Blue Marine Foundation. I'm a restorations project manager working in the Solent Oyster Restoration Project, and also involved with Celine in the Wild Oyster Project.
Thank you. Feline?
Yes, hello, I'm Feline Zuamgassen, and I am a member of the Secretariat for the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. I've had the pleasure of working with the UK, Ireland, the Native Oyster Network on a number of projects. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And Janet, hello. Janet, we just can't. Would you mind putting your microphone on, please? Can anyone see me now? Yeah. Hi, Janet.
Say it again. I'm Janet Brown. I'm representing the Association of Scottish Shellfish Growers, and I'm the editor of the Grower magazine.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we have a series of questions that we can run through quickly, but we're also receiving questions, I think, from the audience as well through the question and answer panel on the side or through Zoom. So I'll keep an eye out for one of those. So with the first question, I'd like to direct this, and we've got Menti going on as well. So there's going to be a series of questions going on. I'm not sure I can see the panelists now that we've got Menti on. So I don't know whether we could just look at Menti off screen. Does that work? Or so I can see the panelists. But just be aware that you've got your meant either on the phone or on your browser as well. So to keep that going while we're at it. And this is how we're going to collect responses from the audience as well as from the panelists. So today you can see projects maturing from pilots and optimizing, moving up to the next scale, which is very nicely put by Bill. How do you think, as we continue to start new initiatives and continue to grow those around them, how do we have a close working collaboration between us? And I'm wondering whether I could put that to Zara first and then Jacob, perhaps, just to think about. So how do we continue to collaborate as the network gets older and grows larger and our sense of ambition improves?
Hi, Alison, thank you. I think your summary earlier really showed the growth that the network already has in quite a short space of time, which is fantastic. And for me, I think we've all been through a very challenging 6 months, but one thing that's come out of that is actually we're using a lot more virtual platforms at the moment and collaborating a lot more widely, and some of the restrictions that may have been in place for certain organisations around resource and subsistence and travel, those barriers have reduced. So actually, if we can build upon this, developing some of these virtual networks, I know it's not ideal and we all want to get out and see each other face to face, but there have been some positives to come from that.
Well, thank you very much. Or Jacob, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think from a personal standpoint, I think the network does a very good job in facilitating information sharing and experience from projects. And I think that's something we should all kind of endeavour to continue as much as we can, where there are new initiatives starting up, where projects that may have, started to establish themselves and got further along are able to share the experiences of the past to facilitate quicker moving projects in the future. And I think also we have a incredibly multidisciplinary network. I mean, there's lots of different people represented on this and organizations represented on this meeting today, and being able to draw on experience from different sectors, from maybe NGOs and also researchers, but also regulators. And we have this forum to be able to draw on the different parts of experience that members have, which I think is really useful.
Thank you. Well, that leads very nicely on to the second question, which I'd like to put then to Janet and Feline. With our current network, we do have a diverse range of members between it, from NGOs through scientists. But as we continue collaborating and growing on, do you think we have the necessary skill sets amongst our members, or are there any areas of industry or any other expert knowledge that we should be looking on, drawing on, and bringing more closely into our network to take our work forward? So Janet, would you mind starting with that?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is that there's a lot of emphasis on doing these sort of monitoring, but working with shellfish growers, there's a lot of, you have passive recruitment of native oysters, but you can't record. Well, it's very difficult to find a way of getting, your baseline data. And I was just wondering if there's any possibility of having resources whereby you could be provided with either the facilities to do a survey, or so you'd have a sort of baseline of what is in existence, something like sort of remote underwater vehicles of surveys. I don't know if this is possible, but
thank you. Feline, do you have any thoughts or any?
I have a couple of thoughts, actually. One is that I think the network works really well. I love to see people engaging through it and sharing their knowledge. It is a real challenge, not because of the network, but because of the way scientific funding is set up and the way that the way that academia is structured. It would be great to see people using the network very actively to try and set up more field sites and more collaboration across existing projects. It is something that is already happening. I'm not saying it's not, but I think it's a really fantastic opportunity that the network provides to allow people to connect really easily with other projects, work out if they have scope, or even can just support in allowing for some of the science to be collected kind of across several projects with different attributes. And that goes for the whole of Europe, actually, not just the UK. And the second thing that I think that the networks provide that I would love to see people making more of is when I look at how fantastic Celine is at the social media and the outreach, and hopefully we're doing a good enough job with that too, but there's so much to be done for outreach and communications, and a lot of that happens at the local scale with individual projects, and I understand how much time that takes individual projects to do, but it would be great to see the networks as kind of low-hanging fruit where you can share those similar experiences and really increase your impact geographically, and that's something I know certainly Selena's fantastic at, so it'd be great to see people taking those opportunities, and if in the future we could build more support for that kind of work in, I think that could be a huge benefit to everybody. Thank you. Yes, it's very important to get into the habit and be disciplined about doing that. I know I probably rely on Celine to do it, which is not fair. Thank you, Celine. So Kieran, I'm wondering whether you perhaps had any thoughts on that as well. So how best to collaborate, and if there are any other skills that we could bring on board to maximise the output of our work.
Thanks. I think I would just echo everybody else's comments in relation to the Native Oyster Network itself. Coming from a background of working for quite a number of years now with native oysters in Lough Foyle, there was very little of an avenue to collaborate and work together, and very few other projects going on. So it's great to see a large amount of work now starting to get targeted at native oysters. And I suppose one thing is consistency and having legacy, and I've been involved in projects in the past, and the normal state of play would be that they're 3 or 4 year projects, and you want to leave a legacy, but I think the Native Oyster Network provides a very good avenue for projects to leave a legacy, so we can have these smaller scale 1 year, 2 year, 3 year projects, but with the foundation of the Native Oyster Network itself for the UK and Ireland, that knowledge can be transferred into the network, and it can be there for years to come. So that's something that other projects, maybe you leave behind a website that doesn't get updated, that goes dead, so that's where the value in the Native Oyster Network really is for me. Brilliant. Oh, thank you. That's a really, really good point. And I think certainly that's something, I'm going now with my technical hat on with our Wild Oyster project. That's what very much we were looking and trying to build that from the outset, trying to create something that would leave a legacy by building capacity, building knowledge and sharing knowledge that, even if when the Wild Oyster project finishes, other people will carry on carrying the can for oysters in the regions around the country. So I think we're all looking at moving towards this ecosystem recovery, and we're all looking to have this, an impact greater than the sum of parts, just like you were mentioning there, Kieran. So are there any clear strategy, or is there a strategy that we could employ as a network of individuals and different organizations to make sure that happens? Is it, for example, continuing regular meetings like today, or sharing scientific outputs, or what are the strategies that we can employ to make sure that we keep motivation and keep our energy to grasp all these opportunities that are going to present us, hopefully, over the next three years or so, or next decade, in fact. Maybe I could go back to Zara for that, and then to Jacob.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was interested to hear what Charlie said, and really sort of combining some of these projects, working in combination across habitats, so combining salt marsh and oyster restoration, and the opportunities this could afford us in terms of greater collaborative working, sharing of resource, match funding, and at the moment, in some ways, we work very much in silos. So taking this more sort of holistic whole water body approach would be something that I think could be really beneficial. I don't know, Jacob's got a...
Thank you. No, that sounds, yes, I think certainly dialogue's moving towards looking individual species to more sort of, wider habitat restoration with the different marine features within that. Jacob, have you got any further thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. I think looking at where oyster restoration can also facilitate, protection or recovery of other habitats of conservation interests is something that could really help, maximize the impact. Also, I think perhaps I'm speaking with my Solent hat on a bit more, where there's a bit more coastal squeeze, but kind of having an open mind as to where oyster restoration can be integrated into coastal defence or other kind of marine planning aspects in your local area, and obviously moving forward with it where it's ecologically and biologically coherent and possible, but maintaining an open mind on those things where that also may come on to the next point, but potential other avenues of where restoration can be resourced.
Thank you. Janet and Feline, do you have any thoughts on this question? What strategy can we employ going forward, working together?
I'll have another go at saying something more sensible. But one of the things I feel that we're missing is something that David has written about, the restoration on Strangford Loch and possibly the potential for the Belfast Loch now, but where you can get very significant restoration just by having broodstock oysters there. And I know this has been happening to some extent in Scottish oyster farms, the Chrysostria farms, but as I say, I was trying to incoherently say in the last thing, if you can't survey, you can't measure it, but it clearly has worked on Strangford Loch, and it's I think we should look further at that.
Okay, thank you. Feline?
Thank you. Just to say that I thought the other panelists' comments were all spot on. I think it is about when we're scaling up, it's not just about scaling up within a particular habitat. It's thinking across the landscapes, across the stakeholder groups, and I think we're all growing into that mindset together, and it's really positive.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's the maturity as we mature as well. Kieran, did you have any final thoughts? And then I'm going to go on to our final question for a quick flurry around about opportunities on the horizon. So Kieran, if you have any further thoughts on strategies, I'll then ask you directly again about any known opportunities that we can collaborate
on. No, nothing really to add to that. The cross working between different projects and even between different zones in terms of the freshwater catchments even and the coastal zone, I think is quite important to remember the linkages with things like the Water Framework Directive, not just Marine Strategy Framework Directive, where nutrient loadings, could be driving productivity within the estuaries. So that's something just to bear in mind as well. So, and maybe an avenue to further funding as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So just a quick reminder to all attending the meeting today that the Mentimeter is going on. We're getting some great responses in, thank you. So just have a little think over the last few minutes before tea break, or maybe you can join in over tea break, but to write any thoughts down. So just carrying on then with you, Kieran, maybe perhaps looking at the water quality is maybe your answer to that, but over the next 3 years or so, say, what are the key opportunities can you see on the horizon, whether it's funding streams or policy initiatives? Where should we be championing the work and the importance of healthy marine ecosystems, notably oysters within that?
Yeah, I think it is all about championing these things. I picked up at the start, one of the key aims of the network was the cultural heritage and the environmental value of native oysters. And I think that's something to bear in mind at all times, that, there is probably a loss in terms of the identity of the native oyster, not just in terms of scientific identity and the amount of work that's been done in the scientific field over the last 50, 60 years, but in terms of its cultural identity, those two things are tied in, I believe, that people have lost that kind of connectivity with native oysters. So trying to promote that, and obviously in this day and age with social media being so important, I'm not for 1 minute advocating that you start a TikTok account for native oysters, but that is the type of thing. It's feeding into education programs, it's getting in touch with the local communities, it's trying to bring it into the 21st century and make it mainstream. And I'm certainly very impressed with the amount of social media coverage that you guys have had within the network and the amount of press coverage that there's been. So I think focusing on that sort of key link to local communities whenever you're developing projects for restoration, because the local communities really will latch on to this type of thing and will be the people that will bring projects much further and maintain and sustain projects. So if there's any way to form local community partnerships within those projects as well, I think that's very important. So
brilliant, thank you. And thank you. Just to very quickly then Feline, then Janet, if you could just offer any opportunities, and then I'll ask Sarah and Jacob, and then we'll go for tea.
I'm not sure I can add any to that. I'm sorry to
I know, that's a great answer.
That was fantastically holistic. I love the idea of thinking through the Water Framework Directive and thinking about the land sea continuum. I mean, I thought it was a spot on answer, so I've got nothing more to add.
Thank you. Janet?
All I can offer is that I'm always very happy to have pieces on native oysters. So if anyone has anything interesting to report, photos, you'll get them published very easily in the Grower, which has a very wide public distribution.
Excellent. Thank you. Jacob?
The only thing I have slightly to add is a kind of restoration practitioner, and often questions I get answered, but the questions I get asked most often these days is more about nature-based solutions and what native oysters can offer in terms of water quality and nutrient reduction. So I don't know as a researcher where that research is or where it needs to get to or what position we need to be in, but I think that's an avenue that I'm increasingly being asked about and potentially is something that will come about in the next few years.
Thank you. Yes, I'd agree with that. And Sarah, final word.
Just to follow on from Jacob, that's what I was going to highlight: natural capital value. Anything that we can do. There's a lot of research out there. Bill summarised some fantastic research, but it's collecting that research and maybe using the network to disseminate it and add real value between, like you said, water quality improvements. Blue carbon is a huge area, so collecting that research, disseminating it, trying to get sort of corporate social responsibility and companies to invest in this kind of restoration would be fantastic.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. I very much enjoyed that discussion with you. Just hand to Celine then to talk about the tea break.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alison. Yeah, so we'll return back at 11:45, so a slightly shorter tea break, just so we can catch up on time a little bit. But yeah, please do go on Twitter and kind of take a look at the content we've been sharing today. We've been sharing some posters that have been submitted for the symposium. But yeah, if we regroup and come back at 11:45, and we'll get started on the research updates continued. Thank you very much. Okay, so maybe if we get back started. So hope that everyone managed to get a chance to visit some of the posters we've been sharing on Twitter. We'll be continuing to share the remaining posters throughout the rest of the symposium, so do keep an eye out there as well. So next up, we're going to be continuing with some research updates. I believe that first we're going to hear from Hannah Lee on Missing the Full Story, Carbon Deposition and the Native Oyster. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah. I'm a member of DEEP. I'm a PhD researcher working on carbon and native shellfish. And today, obviously, I'm going to talk to you about the native oyster specifically. Next slide, please. As we know, native oysters are filter feeders. They remove particulate from the water column, digest it, and deposit it down into the seabed as feces and pseudofeces. This is a route of carbon transport from water to seabed. On top of this, the structure of the shell has the potential to enhance passive deposition. So that's the deposition of sediment as a result of the actual shell structure disturbing the flow of water. This is ongoing and has been shown for horse mussels, and we're looking to demonstrate whether or not this is possible for oysters, but I'll go on to this in a moment. Over time, these sediment deposits, as well as the calcium and carbonate shell, are buried. However, how long this burial lasts for is also a topic of ongoing research. Next slide, please. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through a study that was done at St. Ives Marine Station on the East Coast, looking to quantify the deposition rate of the native oyster. This work will be in the upcoming publication of a special issue in Aquatic Conservation in November. What we were looking to quantify was how much does a living feeding oyster deposit in a naturally fed seawater system. We had live oysters to look at this biodeposition as well as the passive deposition, and dead oyster shells to disentangle the passive deposition from the feeding activities. Next slide, please. What we were able to demonstrate was that the oysters actually trebled the deposition rate from water to box, and in turn trebled carbon deposition. This, in this scenario, equated to roughly 35 milligrams of sediment per oyster per day, or 1.6 milligrams of organic carbon and 0.9 milligrams of inorganic carbon. And that's from deposition, not from shell growth. You can see in the graph that enhancement of deposition, but also it's notable that the dead shell alone, though there was a slight increase, it wasn't significant from there being no oysters at all. And at the moment, we're hypothesizing this is something to do with the low relief of the shells themselves. Next slide, please. These values are a useful tool for both restoration and aquaculture in terms of valuing potential recovery of ecosystem services and also management. For deep oysters, it's 4 million over 40 hectares. That's roughly 51 tons of sediment per year and 1,300 kilograms of inorganic carbon within that, or 2,400 kilograms of organic carbon. Obviously, this may be variable by site, location, and oyster size. Next slide, please. This all leads us to some key questions. Whether or not an oyster bed is a carbon sink, a drawdown of carbon, or a carbon source, a release of carbon. This story in real time is a balance between carbon loss and carbon gain. You can see this demonstrated on the left in this diagrammatic. This is both available in the publication, but also currently at the NORA website. Variability in deposition rate at site-specific locations will change this, and this will change with season and also oyster size and age. But shell and sediment build up over time, as you can see here within the horse mussel reef demonstrated in the bottom right and this side scan. And this is protected by the reef living on the surface. Next slide, please. As we've all discussed so far and are well aware, that the loss of the oyster beds isn't just the loss of a species, it's the loss of ecosystem services. Previous work within our group, which has previously been mentioned, hasn't just demonstrated the potential for carbon deposition, but also connection with fisheries and commercial species, or nursery habitats for young whelks with horse mussels. Ongoing work is also looking at blue mussels and how the carbon is locked up within a bed in different coasts in Scotland. And this kind of data informs management, and also being able to integrate this into valuation of ecosystem services. But further understanding is needed for variability, especially for site-specific values. Next slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So next we're going to hear from Stephen Watson on the Solent Natural Capital Project, update on the value of native oysters in the Solent. Next slide, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephen, a Senior Research Associate at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm going to give you a speed update on the Solent Natural Capital Project. It's a collaboration between the University of Portsmouth and the Environment Agency, and we've essentially been mapping, estimating and valuing native oyster reefs in the Solent. Next slide, please. So a bit of background on the project. We took a natural capital approach to valuing water quality. If you're not familiar with natural capital, we took a three-step approach. First step, we mapped all the native oysters in the Solent region. We then wanted to understand how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and also carbon, also called blue carbon, the oysters in the Solent take out. And as a final step, we then wanted to put an economic value on how much nutrient removal potential the oysters have in the Solent. The outcomes of this project were to help environmental regulators such as the Environment Agency to better understand regulatory ecosystem services, which are often not valued or appraised in a policy context. And secondly, from a research point of view, we wanted to come up with a methodology where we could apply consistently to other temperate coastal systems in terms of valuing water quality and also blue carbon. Since the last meeting, we've now published a paper with the results of our project. So if you are interested or want any more details, please look at the paper on the bottom right of the screen. Next slide, please. To put you in the picture, this is the Solent coastal region. We looked at 12 different estuaries and harbours. It's about 800 kilometres squared. About 80% of the habitat is made up of soft sediment and subtidal habitats. Native oysters take up about 10% of the case study area. Next slide, please. So just to give you some results from the paper, we estimated in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus and carbon that all the habitats in the Solent take out around about £1.1 billion worth of regulatory ecosystem service benefits. We then broke that down for each of the species. I'm just going to show you the native oyster ones now, but we worked out that our native oysters are worth about £44 million worth in terms of regulatory ecosystem services. We then broke this down to the three different ones. They were valued the highest for nitrogen removal, slightly less for phosphorus, and in terms of carbon, they only came out about 0.01 million. That's because, as we just heard, we're not sure if oysters could be a sink or a source of carbon, so that's why that was the lowest value. Next slide, please. So our key messages from our paper are that native oyster beds were an important nutrient sink and also carbon reservoir in the Solent. But the paper also found that seagrass and oyster reefs had the lowest nutrient and blue carbon stores. But we generally know this is because there's been large losses of oysters and also seagrass in the Solent over the past 40, 50 years. So we're hoping now that our framework and the valuations can provide evidence to other projects such as the Solent Restoration Project and other things like the Remedies Project. Next slide, please. So the next step in the project, now that we've quantified water quality and blue carbon, we're now looking to get an idea of the other services that are provided by oyster reefs in the Solent. And we've begun to put values on the aquaculture value, and we're also looking at other services such as nursery function, tourism recreation and aesthetic value. But we're still working on those, and we're hoping a final project report will be available by the end of the year. Next slide, please. And that's it. If you have any questions, please email me here, and please feel free to check out our recent report. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Next, we're going to hear from Hywell Roberts on oysters and offshore wind farms, overview of Orsted and Blue Marine Foundation collaboration.
Steve, I think it's me now with the 40 questions for native oyster restoration.
Ah, thanks, Jo.
Nice. Hello again. So I'm going to try and get us back on time a little bit, and so I'll keep this very snappy. So this is an overview of a paper that Feline Zuam-Gasson led with the rest of the many members from the European Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. And this paper will be coming out in a special edition of Aquatic Conservation imminently. The DOI number at the bottom of the screen is not currently active, but it will be very shortly. It's been accepted and it's in press. And so next slide, please. So this study was really to unlock the top questions that are of importance to the policy and practice of oyster restoration in Europe. And next slide, please. If you just carry on clicking through as the text comes through. And 71 experts were consulted, and this was from 28 institutions across 11 European countries to generate an initial 194 questions. And through a series of voting rounds by a pre-workshop voting round, 1-day online workshop and 2 post-workshop rounds of voting, we had 10 thematic groups emerged in these 194 questions. And these were baselines, restoration methods, site selection, biosecurity, disease management, genetic diversity and population differentiation, novel technologies, quantifying benefits, policy and management, and current and future threats. And now these are really the questions that, if answered, would have the greatest influence on policy and or practice of oyster restoration. And we're hoping that this paper will provide a starting point for developing collaborative projects across the native oyster networks, and to serve to assist policymakers and funders to identify key areas that need to be addressed, to unlock and facilitate the massive scale that we need for oyster restoration and other habitats in Europe. Next slide, please. I think if you could just click through as they come up. So I've just given an overview of some of the 40 questions here, one from each of the areas. I'm not going to read them all out, but here are some example things that we really felt that if this is answered, we would unlock both funding and scaling up of restoration. So one of the key ones in question 1, for example, is looking at what does a reference model system look like for Ostrea edulis? What is the baseline from which to which we're trying to conserve? There was lots of questions around biosecurity, such as how can the biosecurity risk associated with moving oysters through a hatchery supply chain best be minimised? There are lots of questions around population structure and genetic differentiation, and how do we try and maintain any genetic differentiation that exists, maintain population structure, and not reduce genetic diversity. We looked at novel techniques and novel technologies, such as the use of eDNA techniques to assess these biosecurity risks. And something that's come up several times through this symposium today is how does ecosystem service delivery scale with oyster density, and the need to quantify all those. Question number 40 was, how does the presence of Crassostrea gigas affect the demographic development, growth and survival of Ostrea edulis? That's an example of some of the current and future threats we identified. So this is, again, another sneak preview, and this paper will be out imminently. Please feel free to email either myself or Feline Zuam-Gasson if you have any questions about it. And very much giving this overview on behalf of all the authors and the experts who contributed to this paper. Thank you, Celine.
Thanks very much, Jo. Thank you. So next up, we're going to hear some speed updates from industry. So we're going to start off with Chris Ranger on Saving Esther, Cornish native oysters, macro hatchery and aquaculture research site.
Hello. Yep. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me. This really started, or the science really started for me back in 2017. When I stumbled across a World Oyster Symposium held at Bangor University. It is a shame we can't be visiting there today, but thanks for hosting it online. Basically, we were sat in an auditorium, and after a decade of abuse, maybe from fishermen and old boys on the fishery down here, we realised, or I realised, I was in a room with about 150 people that were all talking about native oysters. Part of the problem is overfishing, disease and pollution, and all of those things kind of go on in every habitat. But I feel the overfishing is probably the biggest problem down here. So we set up a community interest company back in 2019. In fact, Celine came to the very first sort of inaugural meeting. It wasn't very well attended, but that just sort of showed that the fishermen have carried on their way and they're going to carry on doing it. I wrote several grant applications last year, unsuccessful with all of them, unfortunately. And one of the feedbacks was that it would be cheaper and easier to buy seed from UK or French hatcheries and put them on the fishery, and that would improve the stocks. I mean, that was really alarming because I knew translocating disease was probably a big problem with the native oyster industry back in the 80s. And there's pretty big evidence that the Bonamia disease was actually introduced via the fowl when a fisherman brought in some oysters from France and then sold the young oysters to other fisheries around the UK. So it's something I'm very aware of. Next slide, please. So I've been collecting data, some from historical research and some from my own growth studies for many years. And you can see in the top sort of left chart is quite a steep decline. There is some data missing. I haven't managed to source what the landings were during those post-war periods, but you can see it's sort of gone from 800 tons down to less than 20 tons. During the war, there was obviously a dip. During the 80s, there was a dip with the Bonamia, and now we're at a perilously low level. The chart at the bottom, most of it is from actual landings data given by Cornwall IFCA, who are the management authority. The last 2 years are actually following the trend. So going on the trend, this season coming up, which starts on the 1st of October and ends on the 31st of March, could be the last season we start landing reasonable amounts. There is a sort of argument that the landings are dependent on the market. And as I've been saying, I think landing or harvesting very young juveniles and selling them to other fisheries has been a big part of this industry for several decades. It's my hope that that kind of stops. We have a protected food name, PDO, Protected Designation of Origin, for the fowl oyster, which means we have to produce, process and package our stock from here. We can't bring it in from another fishery and grow it on like they can in many others. And it's a real shame we're selling our baby oysters to other fisheries. So last year we set up the CIC, and then after unsuccessful funding, I went about one last chance of seeing if anyone else was interested in this fishery, and I did a crowdfunder campaign, Saving Ester. You can see by the hat, Ester as in ESTER, and that's the Cornish word for oyster. We raised nearly £9,000, and it's an always-on campaign, so we can continue raising. And luckily, I managed to borrow some money from the government this year on the bounce back loan scheme, and so we could set up the aquaculture site. Next slide, please. So we did we converted my processing room into a little micro hatchery, and we actually had our first population of larvae in July. So we launched it on the new moon in June, and we had larvae by the full moon in July. As I say, we borrowed some money. We've set up the aquaculture site. We've hired in a little pontoon for a while, and really this little presentation is to see if we can get some volunteers down in the Cornish area to help us with. We've got tons of shell that we need to put into trays for the spat collection. Seeing all the other projects going on, it's a very important part of a restoration. We're sort of calling ours a restoration, but also a repopulation program. And we're only keen really to sell native oysters for the food consumption when we know they've left several oysters behind. The survival rate in the wild's 500,000 to 1, and we want to improve that survival rate. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, so next up, we're going to be hearing from Howell Roberts on Oysters and Offshore Wind Farm, an overview of Orsted and Blue Marine Foundation's collaboration.
Hi, yes, Howell Roberts here. I've spent the last 8 years working within the offshore wind sector with a company called Orsted. And part of what I do with Orsted is to evaluate co-location initiatives. And I wanted to use this slot to provide you with an overview of an oyster co-location initiative that we've been working on with the Blue Marine Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with the offshore wind sector, I have one slide showing the spatial distribution of offshore wind farms across European waters. And then I've got a couple of slides outlining the oyster co-location initiative itself. The slide you can see in front of you now, this shows an offshore wind farm along with the type of crew transfer vessels that are used to service them. Orsted has installed over 1,500 of these turbines, mainly across northern European waters, in particular the UK, but also more recently in places like Taiwan and off the east coast of the US. Next slide, please. So the graphic on the left-hand side shows the geographic spread of offshore wind farms across European waters. The dark blue polygons, these are the operational wind farms. The blue polygons, these are the ones that are currently under construction. Then you've got a range of light blue, grey and white polygons, which reflect the various stages of the consent process. And lastly, the clear polygons, these reflect the upcoming leasing round areas. So with 10 gigawatts of installed capacity, the UK is home to the largest operating offshore wind sector in the world. In the 4 months to April this year, offshore wind generated 30% of the UK's electricity. To be fair, they were the windy months, but nevertheless, for its part, Orsted fully or partly owns 12 of these operational offshore wind farms in the UK, and that accounts for about half of the UK's installed capacity. Looking ahead, in the UK, the government has got a target 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, followed by around 80 gigawatts in 2050 that's going to be required in order to meet the UK's net zero commitment. And we're looking at a similar rollout across the rest of Europe if we're going to meet the EU's own 2050 net zero commitment. The graphic on the right-hand side, that shows the Orsted's transformation from a fossil fuel dominated utility back in 2010 to what will soon be renewable only generation, and this line is compared against what's required from the global energy sector in order to stay below 2 degrees. Next slide, please. So the overall aim of the initiative we developed with Blue was to restore oyster populations along the Essex coastline. We plan to achieve this by installing a number of cages containing adult broodstock oysters within the Gunfleet Sands offshore wind farm. And our hope was that a sufficient amount of oyster larvae would be carried to suitable settlement sites along the coast. An earlier 2018 Dutch initiative that you can see pictured at the bottom left was based on the same idea of installing oyster cages within an offshore wind farm. However, I believe that the Dutch initiative, the main aim of that initiative was to promote the establishment of oysters within the offshore wind farm array area rather than at locations out with. And I think the Dutch initiative ran into difficulties because the cages, which were positioned in between rather than close to the turbine positions, became partially submerged in the sediment, thus inundating the oysters with sediment. So our plan for avoiding this sort of sinking outcome at the Gunfleet Sands offshore wind farm was to install the cages on the scour stones that surround some of the wind turbine positions and provide a stable base. Unfortunately, the feasibility study that was completed earlier this year concluded that the desired coastal settlement was more unlikely than likely. This meant that the investment required to move from the feasibility phase into the pilot phase couldn't be justified. So in order to avoid this in addition to the problems with the probability for success, we also recognised that monitoring was going to be challenging, if not prohibitively expensive, i.e. it was always going to be difficult to confirm a direct link between the adult broodstock oysters and any oysters that were subsequently identified along the coast. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last slide, and it illustrates the scale of the Gunfleet Sands offshore wind farm, and also its proximity to the coast, which is between 6 and 10 kilometres. It's of note that the offshore wind farms that we're constructing today have an overall capacity and often a distance offshore that's around an order of magnitude greater than the Gunfleet Sands offshore wind farm we can see here, which has been around for around about 10 years. So for modern wind farms, the capacity of individual turbines and the spacing between them has increased by approximately threefold. This slide also illustrates the approximate dimension of the layers of scour stones. And in terms of the individual scour stones themselves, the size at Gunfleet Sands ranges between about 2.5 centimetres and 12.5 centimetres. So where next for our initiative, as suggested by the name, the Gunfleet Sands wind farm is located in a sandy but also high energy environment that's unlikely to be conducive to larval settlement. So our next step is to work with Blue to try and establish whether offshore wind farm sites, perhaps with coarser substrates and lower energy metation regimes, might offer more promising oyster restoration outcomes. And just like to finish by pointing out that taking part today, I was really hoping to gain some insights as to what the future of oyster co-location should look like. In particular, I'm keen to look at the differences between caged oysters versus direct seeding on scour stones. Also interested in the difference between creating restoration outcomes within offshore wind farms versus relying on ocean currents to restore populations at distant locations. And finally, I'd really like to better understand the extent to which oysters really do offer a superior ecological outcome versus letting nature decide on the type of flora and fauna that should develop within a wind farm area. And that's it from me for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So next we're going to hear from Patrick McMurray, Shuckers Paddy, Native Oysters in the Global Marketplace, One Shuckers Perspective. I'm afraid we can't hear you yet, Patrick.
There we go.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Got it. Super. Thank you. Hi there. As we were just saying, I'm the end user. I'm the shucker. So all of your work comes together, has to pass through my hands, and therefore we become just before to give it to the customer. We are the last bastion to showcase your work, and we do that translation of what you've done with the oyster to put it into the customer's hands. I'm a world champion Guinness Book of World Records oyster shucker. That just means that I'm a very good oyster shucker. Really, in the end, what you want to see is more people will be able to, there's more busboys, dishwashers are usually the shuckers that go in. So what I'm going to describe is what we need to see in an oyster when you're growing it up. Next slide, please. There you go. So we're the quality control. We translate your work and to the customer in tasting notes, and that's why sometimes we're called sommeliers, oyster sommeliers as well. In Canada, we get to open 5 different species of oysters: Crassostrea virginicus, Crassostrea gigas, Crassostrea sakima, Ostrea edulis, yes, we grow them here, and Ostrea lorida. So we have a great myriad of different flavors, and this is what's in the marketplace as well as what you would have to see in North America. In Europe and other places, there's usually about 2 different species that you're working with as well. So that's what you're up against as far as flavors and tastes go. Merroir is a word that I've worked with, that I wrote up in my little book, The Oyster Companion, with a tasting wheel that describes the taste of place for the oyster in the water that it comes from. And native oysters, European flats, as we call them here in North America, speak of the ocean more than any other oyster out there. And it's really that taste of place that is most exciting for the palate and for oyster shuckers and proper oyster bars to sell this type of oyster. Next slide, please. that being said, the oyster, as you can see, is also part of the slow food movement and marking out that arc of taste and that biodiversity for the different regions. Like the gentleman was just talking about, the ester, the fall oyster has got an appellation. They're wild oysters from the Kellys. We import those into Canada, and they truly smell, when you're opening them up, smell exactly like Galway Bay, which is absolutely fantastic. It captures that flavor and it transports over. The Loch Ryan oyster, I served to a couple of Scottish folks here in Toronto once, and they literally teared up because it tasted like home. And that is why it's so important to be able to bring that type of oyster to the market. And this is also the oyster for seasonality, months without an R. We've just started with September to reintroduce the oyster into the marketplace, and it's cause for what we call celebrations, where you have the big festivals right now, and it goes right until May. And the beautiful thing about that is what the restaurants will be looking for as well, the seasonality. So something you can celebrate with right down to the closure in May. We also do a celebration when we close that out to celebrate that oyster and the diversity that it showcases. Next slide, please. So for the growers, this is what we are looking for as far as restaurants go. I always tell the growers, if you want to sell one oyster, find great water. If you want to sell 2 oysters, grow great shell. If you can, work on the shell, however you want to grow it. We want to see a hard shell with a large hinge. And that allows anybody to open it up, which is great. Smaller shell is okay, not to sell off the babies, but if you need to get oysters to the market sooner, you can sell it to the restaurants with a smaller shape, a 5 or a 0, as they say here, or something that's smaller that you wouldn't normally sell is actually a marketable oyster. Cocktail grade oysters is the thing now in North America. It's a 2.5 centimeter, 2.5 inch, sorry, oyster, but it gets to the retail market a lot easier. Native oysters are a little bit finicky in transport. As you can see in the top picture, those are lobster bands in Maine. They lobster band the oysters so that they hold the shell together. The Irish ones in the baskets here with a little bit of seaweed are compressed, cup side down, so that they will travel very well. They have, native oysters have about 7 to 10 days on the market. So that's shelf life in the fridge. So that's not a lot of time compared to other oysters, 14 to 30 days, sometimes a little bit longer on our East Coast oysters. So that's what restaurants are looking for. They want something that's got a good transportability and can work a couple of days once they get to the fridge. Seaweed, I always find, is great as a value-added package because it keeps the oyster happy in the shell, in the actual basket, and then we can use it again as a display on the plates. And so for the customer, what we look forward to is teaching the people about the flavor, the education of the grower, the location, the terroir, the taste of that region that it comes from. For training, we always train the shucker how to handle and store these oysters and take care of that. Pairing it, what best to pair with it, beer, wine, spirits, or cocktail, and recipes. So if you're going to cook with the oyster or sauces, maybe make a regional sauce that tastes of that region as well. And the main thing is the seasonality, is this sense that it's important to showcase the native oyster and restore that into the local areas so that it is something that we can celebrate every season, the opening of the flat season, no matter where it comes from. And it's important to get that flavor and that taste of region into the marketplace. And that's why I'm here, hoping that you can grow more fabulous oysters for us to shuck, no matter where we're at.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Patrick. So now we're moving on to our discussion session number 2. So the sourcing of oysters for restoration. This discussion is going to be chaired by Morven Robertson, and I will allow all of the kind of panelists to join us, and Morven on the screen now.
Great. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And I'd like to say a big welcome to our panelists. I'm going to ask all of them to introduce themselves, starting with the first person I can see. So Tristan, I can see you at the top of my screen. David next, Trish, and then Liz. I think that's everyone, unless there's people I can't see. Oh, and David, are you also joining our session? There you are.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm on now.
Fab. So if we could start with Tristan, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Tristan Hugh-Jones, and we grow oysters in Cork in Southern Ireland, where we've got ponds for breeding oysters, and we also run the Loch Ryan oyster fishery in Scotland.
Great, thank you, David.
Hi, yeah, I'm David Smith. I work with Bangor University in the Shellfish Centre as a science officer, and we're working on the Conway Oyster project and also one down in Swansea with OEC Farms.
Thank you. David Donnan.
Hello everybody, I am David Donnan from NatureScot, the recently rebranded Scottish Natural Heritage as we were formerly known. So we're the Scottish Government's advisor on biodiversity in Scotland, and I've had a long-standing involvement in native oyster work.
Thank you, Trish.
Hi everybody, I'm from the Irish Sea Fisheries Board based in Dublin, Bord Iascaigh. We're a development agency for fisheries and aquaculture, and I work with the shellfish producers in particular.
Thank you. And Liz?
Hi everyone, my name is Liz Ashton. I'm based at the Portofino Marine Lab at the Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and I've worked on a few native oyster projects in Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome all, and we are going to be talking about sourcing of oysters for restoration. Really fun topic and something that I'm very interested in. So the first question we have is, what are the main factors oyster restoration projects need to consider when sourcing oysters? Quite interested in this, but everyone has quite different answers. So maybe we could start with Tristan and David Donnan. Maybe Tristan, you could share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this. I was thinking that I guess the main factors are probably a disease related one. Either there are two options. One is to try and restore native oyster beds with Banamia filled oysters, and hope that there's some sort of resistance going on with an oyster, which I think people feel has been shown in particular places. Or you actually have naive oysters that haven't been exposed, and you try and keep them spaced apart. And I guess the other thing really is that there are limited areas where native oysters actually survive. There are areas around the UK and Ireland that thrive with native oysters, and the reason that happens is because of the hydrodynamics. You know, the water is retained, the larvae is retained, and there's also the substrate to settle. But if any of those things are missing, then the restoration, you can populate an area with oysters, but maybe to actually restore a self-sustaining population is either very difficult or impossible. So really, I suppose it's looking historically at the areas that used to have oysters and probably supporting those areas. Obviously, areas that have never really had native oysters can certainly be native oyster sanctuaries and help populations, but I doubt they would ever have a self-sustaining population.
I think that's a really good point, and something that you above, thinking of. I think a lot of projects start up with huge community involvement and making sure you really do, I guess, your due diligence with literature reviews and really talking to people about what was there before is quite important. David Donnan, do you have anything to add to that on that question?
Yeah, I think I very much echo what Tristan has said. From a Scottish perspective, there's sort of three things that I would pick up on. One is that, understanding of the existing native oyster populations that were there in the history, or the natural history of the area that the project is concerned with. I think that's absolutely crucial. The other thing is biosecurity, and as well as disease, there's the invasive non-native species angle to take into account as well. And that varies obviously tremendously across the British Isles and Ireland because of the different species that are present or not present across that geographical spread. And then the other thing, not surprisingly from my perspective, is just thinking about the legislation and the consenting framework. Something that we're learning with this new projects, and native oyster restoration is certainly a young and fairly novel activity. It raises all sorts of issues to do with consenting, and so there's lots of learning to do with that at the moment. So it's very much an iterative process.
Okay, thank you. And Trish, are you able to perhaps share a perspective from Ireland?
Sure, yeah. I would very much agree with what Tristan and David said there as well. The only other thing that may be an issue, particularly if it's not so much a completely extinct fishery that you're trying to repopulate, may be that it might be better to work with a local source of native oysters. And there probably needs to be a bit more work done on that area, whether bringing broodstock from another fishery and maybe bringing it to a hatchery for redeployment elsewhere, or even bringing it to spatting ponds in another area, whether or not it will do as well as a local population. Would be something that I would like to see a bit more research done on.
Thank you. That's interesting, and I think something I haven't seen happen maybe at a government level is a discussion around if there's not a local source available, should a restoration project be allowed to start, in that area? How are we really setting up these projects? Coming on to the next question, with growing movement of oysters for restoration purposes, how will we maintain genetic diversity and viable wild populations? So I know lots of projects can't find the oysters that they need, so we're looking further and further afield, and is that the right thing to do? So Liz, maybe you could share some thoughts on that in the first instance.
Yeah, well, there has been translocations of the native oysters for hundreds of years, whether that's just put and take fisheries or they have been grown on. I'm not a geneticist, but I do value the importance of any genetic diversity there is. So I agree that it should be, as Trish says, from the local area or the local broodstock first and foremost.
Thank you. And David Smith, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, defining a local broodstock could be difficult because a lot of the oysters that are in sites they're in aren't indigenous to the area. Just also want to point out, I think if you're moving oysters around and translocating for sources, I think you're better going with Benemia exposed oysters as opposed to Benemia naive. I think we need to sort of think outside the box a bit with this. Benemia is in the system, and the best way to prepare for it, I think, is to have an oyster that's been exposed to it as opposed to an oyster that's naive to it. I know in my own experience in Strangford Lough, Benemia was discovered, and there was quite a bit of die-off in sort of 2005 on, but the population has rebounded, and it's actually doing quite well. And these are large, mature oysters, and to get to that size, there must be some sort of resilience to disease. I think to put an oyster in a designated Benemia area that doesn't have a resilience is folly, and there's a lot of money being invested in these projects, and I think when it comes to sourcing oysters and biosecurity and translocating stock, it's maybe something that needs to be considered a bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Tristan, maybe you can talk a bit about this, because we have tried that with you. We took some oysters from Tristan that were negative and put them in the Solent, which is thought to be positive. But one of our biggest challenges is that not every estuary accepts that they might be positive, and we just haven't done that kind of testing at maybe the level that's needed. So Tristan, yeah, go for it.
I guess I can talk, yes, either with our oysters from Loch Ryan, which are Banamia free, which we have sent around for various restoration projects, and we wish them well. The other thing, I guess, is yes, our breeding in Ireland, when we had Banamia from the early 1987, where we lost a huge amount of our oysters, then we have since bred from survivors, and so we are now. Now we were cleaning an area this year where we found an oyster that was about 30 years old. So we hope to send that up to Hannah in Heriot-Watt University, because we have the records of that area of the oysters that we put out almost down to the pond it was bred in. And in our best years after that, we've had a good crop of survivors in a Banamia area. Interestingly, in Cork, we've had difficulty, even though we've had an intense Banamia wipeout and all the rest of it. We sometimes have tried to do experiments infecting naive oysters in Cork, and we've actually struggled to get them infected, even though they're right next door to other diseased oysters. Speaking of genetic diversity, I think there was a paper in about 2016 with identifying 3 different sort of zones, and it was purely relating to the different areas where people traded. So there's an Irish, British, and French cluster. There's a Spanish cluster, and then there's a Dutch and Danish cluster. But that's really just relating, I think, to the historical movements of oysters. And I think I would argue that Europe is big enough, and there's enough genetic diversity that we've got at the moment. I don't think yet we've got any problems with worrying about where our native oysters are coming from, and whether obviously if people have got local stocks, that's the one way of being biosecure, is by not bringing in anyone else's oysters. But if you're not in that position, then you have to get your oysters from somewhere, and then you just have to choose where you get them from.
Great, thank you. So the next question is around, does the panel think that borrowing broodstock for spawning events and returning post-spawn is feasible, considering the shortage of fecund adults? David Donnan, maybe you can speak to this as Scotland from a Scottish perspective.
Sure. I mean, again, this question, absolutely underlines the value of the existing native oyster populations that we have. And there's sort of 2 priorities from our perspective. One is the need for protection of those existing populations, and as keeps coming up in these questions, a better understanding of the resource in terms of the location and abundance of those animals, and the natural history of what's happened. So again, even in relatively isolated places in Scotland, there is, if you go back and look, you can find some records with respect to movements of oysters about. So there are these sort of genetic, implications, as Tristan's mentioned. I think that these existing populations clearly have got an important role with respect to the potential providing of broodstock. But that'll have to be done in a sustainable way, and an essential precursor to that is understanding the status of the populations that animals might come from. And so historically, there hasn't been a great amount of dedicated survey for native oysters. And so we've got quite good sort of understanding of individual locations, which have come up in in other surveys. So presence is there, but abundance data to go with that is usually lacking. There's certainly in Scotland, there's only a few sites that have had dedicated survey. So that's something we're constantly trying to improve the evidence base. And there is a science and government aspect to that, but there's also a citizen science aspect to that as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm being pressed on time, so I'm going to just ask the final question, but I think it would be quite nice to hear from all 5 of you, but very quickly, just kind of one sentence. I think this is a really interesting question. Should commercial growers be encouraged by government to link up with restoration practitioners to supply oysters for restoration purposes? Should there be more strategic input from government for this? And this is something I really think personally needs to happen, but I'd be really interested to hear from all of you, maybe starting with Liz, then Trish, David Smith, David Donnan, and then Tristan.
I would say yes, although it will depend on the location and the end purpose. So say like you're in the foil where Kieran is, and you have aquaculture and the fisheries in the same location, they can help support each other. Or if it's in nearby locations, I think getting government support to help that, because the Ostrich is a little bit more difficult to grow than the Gygas and take a bit longer. So I think, yeah, that's a good idea.
Trish?
Yeah, absolutely. I think well, it's probably already happening in Ireland anyway. A lot of the fisheries are providing broodstock to various research projects. But yeah, so yes, this is my answer as well. I suppose as well, what would be important that the fishermen know that they're not going into competition. In terms of what are the broodstock, the end purpose, is it going to be for the market, or is it just going to be restoration? Because markets are obviously a very important consideration, and it is very tough on the European market for native oysters. But I think also native oyster fishermen would love to get paid for their broodstock to benefit another project.
Just really quickly then, David Smith, then David Donnan, and then Tristan.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think a bit of input from government would really kickstart the whole process, and it would give the growers a bit of incentive. One of the main problems is there's not a lot of growers in the UK at the minute. So yeah, any sort of incentive to kick off production of broodstock can only pay dividends. And yeah, certainly, I think it's a great idea.
Thank you.
I think I would echo what Trish is saying. I think to some extent this is already happening, but there's certainly scope for how it's going to develop. I mean, there's a dynamic between business and government, but also with the support from the academic community. How that, you know, the discussion around aquaculture and the development of shellfish aquaculture is crucial here. So let's say I think this is inevitable. What it's going to look like, I can't see the shape for that at the moment, but it's something that's happening.
Thank you, Tristan.
Absolutely, and I guess there are on the conference now. We've got Richard Hayward from in Essex. There's Chris Ranger from Cornwall. There's my brother's over in Ireland at the moment, and we've got Loch Ryan. So there are producers growing oysters, and we'd love to sell them to anyone for any purposes. So restoration or restaurants, we're ready to go.
Great, and hopefully by working with the government we can come up with a safe kind of way to do it all, which is kind of everybody is on board with. So thank you very much to the panelists. I believe there'll be more questions around this topic on Twitter later. I think it's something we could all keep talking about for an hour. But yeah, I'm going to hand back over, I think, to Celine. So thank you very much, everyone, for sharing with us today.
Thanks very much, Morven. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. Like you say, I feel like we could go on talking about for hours. But yeah, so next we'll be moving on to discussion session number 3. So Horizon Scanning and Research Gaps, chaired by Dr. Joanne Preston.
Good afternoon, all. So thank you to Bose Hancock, Oliver Tully, Hannah Lee, Tim Bean, Monica Fabra and Bill Sanderson for joining in with this discussion. And the first question we've got today is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to scaling up native oyster restoration in UK and Ireland? And how can the network help facilitate that? Bose, I'm going to go to you first with your global expertise. If you'd like to introduce yourself the first time you make a comment with where you're from, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks, Jo. Bose Hancock, currently located in the US actually, but Australian originally. And I've been working in oyster restoration for 17 years now, I think. And the last 5 or 6 years has been really deliberately trying to move some of the learning that's been done from the US out to other geographies that are interested in starting some of that work. And to answer the question, what are the barriers and what's the role of the network in breaking down some of those barriers? It's really quite impressive to me that even though native oyster restoration is actually quite new in Europe and the UK, the learning that's been done in other regions is something that can be used as a springboard to really ramp up the speed at which we can develop anywhere new. So there is quite a lot of learning that's been done. There's a lot of experimentation that's been done. For the European native oyster, the west coast of the US, Australia and New Zealand are probably the most relevant places because they're dealing with Ostrea species, some of them very closely related. But using those examples, understanding what those examples are, how they've gone about it in other places, and applying that to really scale as rapidly as possible in Europe and the UK has actually been proven to be feasible, particularly in Australia, which is started in 2015. They started on native oyster restoration there and have moved to a scale of multiple projects, tens of millions of dollars very quickly. So that's the core function of these networks is sharing that kind of information, sharing those kind of stories, and making sure that nobody's reinventing the wheel. We're actually using information that has been developed anywhere to the maximum advantage. So these networks are, I think, incredibly critical.
Thank you, Bose. Tim, would you like to contribute to that question?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, so I suppose the single biggest barrier is probably what the question is at the moment. In terms of scaling up, it probably has to be the supply of oysters, be them seed or broodstock, for the increased production. At the moment, there probably simply isn't the number of oysters available for the ambition that exists. And so to deal with that, how the actual network can perhaps help remove that as a barrier. We've already talked about some of the production lines and the supply chains for oysters. And we all know there's a great deal of risk involved in oyster production on any level, be it from hatchery or in natural ecosystems. So perhaps the network can work with suppliers to fund production from perhaps a more basic level. So rather than buying oysters that are ready to go on your site, for example, paying for or helping to mitigate the risk with production by funding production from the point go to the point at which you use those animals. And alongside that, trying to broaden the production mechanisms we use. So more hatcheries, more places for broodstock, more safe sites for animals to be made.
Great, thank you, Tim. Monica, I'll move over to you now as you're next on my screen. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm Monica Fabra and I'm a PhD student at the University of Portsmouth. I'm working in collaboration with the Blue Marine Foundation on the Solent Oyster Restoration Project. And yes, this is a great question. I don't think there is one big barrier, but yes, of course, the supply of oysters is the biggest, I think, in terms of scaling up. But also, I think the standardization of the methods and the protocols, this is a huge problem still. Even if, I mean, the UK and Ireland is not, it doesn't cover a big area. At the same time, I think there are serious and big differences in geographical characteristics, if it's right. So I think even for example, talking about Bonemia, there are areas more and less affected. So I think the standardization of the methods is still a big issue because, of course, many different things need to be taken into account, like the source and the target sites and all the studies involved in this process. So I think for me personally, this is the biggest issue. And as David Smith said in the previous discussion, I think the local supply of oysters should be prioritized, I think, because of the differences in the different areas.
Geographic rooms. Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Monica. Oliver, you are next on my screen, so please, if you'd like to give your contribution.
Hi, thanks. I'm Oliver Tully. I work with the Marine Institute in Galway. I'm coming from a background of fisheries, really, and fisheries assessment of shellfish, and that's why that's what brought me into oyster restoration projects. Scale up, yeah, there's a lot of issues here, I think, on scale up. Of course, with increased scale up, we will need scale up in funding as well. And coming from the kind of perspective of, so I'm working with an organization that's providing the funding, and then I'm also working with the groups who are undertaking the work programs. And we're not spending tens of millions or hundreds of millions here. We're spending tens of thousands of euros. And the question is, what would happen if we asked for millions of euros? And that's, I think we need, and of course I have to read the handbook, but we need metrics of success to demonstrate what the cost benefit is and what the investment risk is, certainly. And that's, I think, really important. If you ask me to what degree are we succeeding in restoration projects in Ireland today, it'd be difficult to quantify that. And with increased request for scale up in funding, we need to be able to demonstrate that. The network, I think, could help in achieving that, because I think there's almost a need for a peer review process within the network to ask the difficult questions that every project should be asked, as in, what are you doing and why are you doing it, and how do you know when you're going to succeed, or if you are succeeding. You know, we're all kind of interested in restoration. Do we have any cynics or skeptics within the network? I'm not sure we have, and there's a risk of kind of groupthink. I think we're all sufficiently objective not to fall into that trap, but nevertheless, I think it would be useful to develop a peer review process in evaluating project proposals and programs on an annual basis. The other, David Owen mentioned the consenting. I think if we scale up significantly, the consenting process will become an issue, and how we interact with that consenting process will be really important. And then, of course, there are also all of the technical issues associated with scale up. You know, if the supply of culture is limited, if we need to do that. I think the question about, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, how self-sustaining are restored populations, and what is their natural condition? And in other words, can we stop restoring at a given point in time and say we now have a self-sustaining population that is productive? And in Ireland, we have undisturbed existing populations which appear to be exist in a natural condition at a low level. And I don't know why that is. So there are lots of questions similar to that related to scale up. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. I was wondering who would be the first person to mention money, of course. And one of the things we saw when we were out in the States is the scale of the restoration hatcheries comes with large-scale funding and large-scale momentum and investment from the government, as well as networks like this. Thank you. Bill, over to you. You're next on my screen.
Okay, well, actually, my thoughts are quite similar to Oliver's and those that you just reflected, in that I think the biggest barrier to scale up is really the financing, the funding of what we're doing. At the moment, we're operating at tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pounds, and we need to be operating at millions in many cases. And actually, to attract millions, you need to be able to unlock the business model. And to me, that's about ecosystem services and ecosystem function, which is why my team's been investing quite heavily in that area. And we've heard from Hannah on blue carbon. But I think if you're wanting people to put their money on the table, you have to be able to say what it's going to achieve, and you have to be able to say that with some degree of clarity. And that's why I think that's a really critical piece of the jigsaw that this network can help deliver.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. And Hannah, a nicely segue to you if you have any extra thoughts to add to the previous panelists.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I'm going to echo everyone that has come before me, and that sourcing, but also just the biosecurity of that sourcing, working with industry to scale up the ability to access the numbers that all of these different projects, many people are from here today, but also keep in mind the biosecurity side of things, not just for diseases, but also the non-native species that we don't want to be introducing, especially to sites where they don't already exist. So certainly I think that's probably one of the biggest considerations. And from an ecosystem services point of view, it's just sharing this knowledge. I mentioned structure earlier, but structure just doesn't just potentially enhance carbon. It also gives the structure for communities and biodiversity to develop. So maybe that's something as well that we need to think about how reefs are being restored. And if that's a consideration of the structure that we're putting back in.
Thank you, Hannah. And that leads us on quite nicely to the next question. I would love to get to this concern. There are concerns that as restoration projects increase the native oyster population, we're not at that scale yet, but there is an increased risk of transmission of pathogens from disease-free to disease-affected area via naturally occurring vectors. Do you think we should or could mitigate for this? I'm going to start with the same order, so I'll start with you, Bose.
Okay, well, this is a really important question. There's no question at all that to remove a pathogen completely, the most effective way of doing that is to remove the host. So if you take oysters out of the system, you take out the pathogens that go with them. Conversely, putting more oysters back into the system provides more hosts and more opportunities for pathogens to multiply. The other side of that same equation is I really have to endorse the comments from David Smythe earlier on. You know, the pathogens, once they're introduced, are endemic. There are no examples anywhere of getting pathogens out of the system once foreign pathogens have been introduced. So there is no alternative but to work with those pathogens. And that really does force us to focus on any kind of disease tolerance that can be developed within the populations that we're using. A lot of people have commented on the need to take advantage of any local adaptation using local broodstock where possible. But there's an incredibly important layer that we need to be focusing on top of that, which is taking advantage of any natural selection to disease resistance that has occurred within populations that have been subjected to high levels of disease. And that's a process that you can actually map out around the world. We've been incredibly good at moving pathogens from one place to another around the world. And this same experiment has taken place with far too many species, both of host and pathogens, on a global scale. And the number of generations required to develop a degree of tolerance or resistance to disease is not that high. It's a very severe selection pressure. So the resistance does develop quite quickly, and taking advantage of that has got to be a primary consideration.
Thank you, Bose. The order's mixed around on my screen now, so I'm going to go to Tim Bean next to works a little bit on this, don't you, Tim?
Sorry, I didn't introduce myself last time, did I?
Yeah,
Tim
no.
from Roslin Institute in Edinburgh, where we study host pathogen interactions in oysters, essentially, and the genetics of disease and disease resistance. So, I mean, obviously, this is a huge and almost inevitable risk. If you increase numbers, as Bose said, I can't reiterate that enough, you will increase the amount of disease. And I suppose it's worth looking at this on 2 timescales. So if we think long into the future and we have a fully functioning, naturally restored Austria edgeless habitat, then actually the thing we're aiming for is the spread and flow of disease and natural, essentially homeostasis and a balance of a population. So we can't say that we should definitely mitigate against that, because in the end point, that's actually where we want to be, 100 years in the future. But if we're talking very short term, and there's real dangers associated with this question, not only in terms of the regulatory landscape and being careful to make sure we don't breach regulation and thus completely scupper the chances of taking things further, but also from public perspective and from managing relations with the aquaculture food industry direct, and being careful not to move oyster diseases into areas where oysters are currently successfully found without the presence of disease. So should we mitigate against it? Currently, in a short term, without question, yes, we have to try and prevent the spread of disease. And one of the ways of doing that is to prevent the exponential growth of disease in areas where we increase numbers of oysters through the use of, if possible, resistant or tolerant animals. As we know, when it comes to the biggest disease, Benamia, it can be quite tricky to do such a thing. There's no current available method to identify resistant animals in a naive population. We have to expose animals to the pathogen to find out if they're tolerant. In doing so, we can't then move those animals to an area, because of regulatory reasons, we can't then move those animals to an area where there is no disease. So there's some real technical barriers to be crossed here, which may be possible with genetics, but we're not quite there yet.
Thank you, Tim. Well, I think this is certainly, this and the other questions that I have going to be posing to the panel, something we could talk about for far longer than is allocated for the symposium. So I've apologies to the panelists, but I've been asked by the organising committee to wrap it up now, but we're not actually wrapping it up, because thank goodness for social media, Mentimeter and Twitter. There are 2 other questions that we're really keen to get both the panelists' insight into and the members, which will be put up on the Mentimeter and Twitter. So I'm going to thank my panelists. You were changed by the enthusiasm of previous presenters, and thank you, and hand you over to Feline, Zu and Gasson.
Thank you very much, Jo. It was really exciting to hear this panel discussion, and it just reminded me that this was a fantastic opportunity to tell all of those of you on the call who aren't already aware that there is a NORA production working group that we will be meeting in person at the aquaculture meeting in Cork next April. And during that working group, the intention was in fact to draft up a policy brief, which would be aimed at policymakers to address this funding issue, and hopefully at least act as a stepping stone and a bit of a galvanization to getting the policymakers to understand the regulatory need and the policy need for supporting hatcheries, seed supply, spatting ponds, if they want to see more oyster restoration in Europe. So if you're interested at all, please do have a look at the website, do sign up, do come along and share your ideas. If you aren't able to be there in person, we will be drafting it online as well. So please do get in touch. It sounds like there's a lot of enthusiasm for this topic among the people on this call. So please do take that opportunity to contribute to that and let your opinions be known and your ideas flow. Thank you very much, Jo.
Thank you, Feline. I think back over to Celine for a wrap up.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Jo. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been great to have such fantastic attendance, both online on Zoom and YouTube today. As Alison mentioned at the beginning of the symposium, I think it's fantastic to kind of reflect on the the progress that the network has made over the last few years in terms of our understanding of restoration activities, research, and also how there's still a lot more for us to kind of unlock and understand. It's been great to reflect on our progress and fantastic to hear from Joe, kind of hearing about the progress that we've made in terms of our publications, which you can expect to see published in November of this year. Thank you to all of our presenters and kind of speed updates from oyster restoration projects, industry, and also research. And thanks for our chairs and panelists for participating in some very interesting discussion sessions, some of which I'm sure we could talk about for a very long time. So what we're going to do is we're uploading those questions onto our Twitter feed as we speak, and yeah, after the symposium, if there's any thoughts that you haven't been able to share and you would like to, please feel free to engage with us on Twitter to carry on that conversation. And thank you to everyone participating on the online Mentimeter, sharing your thoughts. We'll be sharing that along with the minutes as well. And so finally, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Maria Hayden-Hughes and Karen Tewson, along with their colleagues at the Bangor University Shellfish Centre, for hosting and helping us to facilitate this online symposium. I'm sure you can all agree it's been very smooth and definitely made it a lot easier for us to continue with our network symposium despite the current kind of social distancing. So thank you very much, and yeah, look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.